Ken, how's it going, my man?
Oh, life is good, buddy. Life's good.
Good. You know, we were just talking about our kids here, and you were saying your son like works on like nuclear stuff, right? Now,
Rare metals, germanium to be exact. Yeah.
rare metals. Okay, so it got me thinking actually. Gilligan's Island. The professor could make like a nuclear reactor out of two coconut shells, but he couldn't patch a hole in the boat. So, just saying, there's there's an obvious loophole. Now, look, that's why you listen to this podcast, right? Because you're not going to get a Gilligan's Island reset on any other Mormon podcast anywhere. But dude, how's it been going?
Life's good. This is a very good time. Well, my daughter had appendicitis 2 weeks ago,
Ooh,
an
she
emergency
okay?
appendectomy, but the miracle for me, they went into the emergency room, gave her a CAT scan at 1:30 a.m. By 2:30 a.m., the thing was out. She was home at 10 o'clock the next morning with three band-aids on her tummy, and she's feeling better than ever. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a miracle. A miracle. And the doctor's like, oh yeah, we do six of these a day. And I'm like, you guys are amazing. I mean, years ago she'd have been dead.
Yeah,
And
it wasn't that long
now
ago,
she
right?
feels great.
It was like a person and a half ago. You're risking life and limb, right?
Well,
I
yeah.
mean, that's all there is to it.
But no,
Yeah, no, it's
life's good.
good. Good. I'm glad to hear it. Well, look, I did an episode back in December where I talked to Rod Meldrum for a little while, and I've been I want think of me as fair and balanced. I don't want to give just one side of the story, right? He talked about the Heartland model, um, and so I wanted to get someone else on who wasn't somebody from the Heartland camp. And Ken's like, I'm your guy. And I'm like, we always have a good conversation. So let's do it.
I
Now, look, I want to
thought
say
you were
that
gonna say, I thought you were gonna say, so I asked the guy and he turned me down, so I asked Ken.
no, no, I haven't asked anybody else yet. This is one of those things like normally I'm really against Mormons fighting each other, right? On this topic though, I'm like, this is one we should all be able to like it should kind of be like when you see a good boxing match, right? And then
Oh yeah.
they just kind of hug it out afterwards and go to their various ways, right? And so, look, this is something you can have a healthy debate about and not have to split over. I want to get that out of
Oh
the way
yeah.
right now. If you are basing your whole testimony of the Book of Mormon and the restored gospel based on where you think the events took place, stop it because you're going to be sorely disappointed. Get a testimony of the spiritual stuff and then dive into this. But this is going to be fun. I am so excited. And just so everybody knows out there, I am a Heartlander, more of a soft Heartlander, but a Heartlander nonetheless. And you should approach these things kind of with this mindset of if tomorrow where I think the Book of Mormon took place, if it was proved otherwise that it took place in Central America, you should be able to take that and run with it, right? This
Yeah.
shouldn't be something that you base your whole testimony around.
Well, my testimony's hanging by a thread, buddy. That mine, I have to be right, or
Is
else
it?
I'm
Is
done.
it? You gotta be right
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best to make sure I preserve that for you.
Yeah. You're gonna wreck me good.
All right, let's go.
All right, you gonna let me share my screen?
Didn't I already grant you permissions on that?
Oh, now you did. Awesome. Thank you. Here we go. Ah,
The preface.
so you've been around this block a few times.
Yes.
If you were to ask a Heartlander to justify what they believe, typically what do they resort to right off the bat?
Typically, it's something said by Joseph Smith about the letter he wrote back to Emma about crossing the plains of the Nephites and those sorts of things.
Very, very good. Exactly. And if you were to do the same to a Mesoamericanist, what's their go-to to justify what they believe?
So for them, I think a lot of it is that the actual geography fits down there, as well as all those ruins. And look, they had a thriving civilization down there, right? There were highways
Yeah,
that connected up from city to city. I mean, there's some good stuff. It does talk about cement in the Book of Mormon, and I know there's a form of cement down there that they use. So those are typically what I hear.
excellent. Um,
Now, to be fair, I normally don't take sides in this argument. To be fair, I just kind of stir the pot and watch everybody else fight because that's just good, clean family fun.
hey,
Um,
if
so
you have a gift, you got to share it. You
that's
know.
right. I gotta share it. So I might go to the Heartlander guy and be like, "You hear what that Mesoamerican guy just said? You gotta take that from him." So
Absolutely.
yeah,
You know, a, a couple of my very best friends in my ward, we spar all the time over this stuff, and we have so much fun.
as we should.
So let's get some of the official stuff out of the way. Since the publication of the Book of Mormon in 1830, members and leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have expressed numerous opinions about the specific locations of the events discussed in the book. Some believe that the history depicted in the Book of Mormon, with the exception of the events in the Near East, occurred in North America, while others believe that it occurred in Central America or South America, or some say the Baja Peninsula, some say Madagascar, some say Indonesia. I mean, they're all over the place. Although church members continue to discuss such theories today, the church's only position is that the events of the Book of Mormon describes took place in the ancient Americas. The church does not take a position on the specific geographical location of the Book of Mormon events in the ancient Americas. Speculation on the geography of the Book of Mormon may mislead instead of enlighten. Such a study can be a distraction from its divine purpose. Individuals may have their own opinions regarding Book of Mormon geography and other such matters about which the Lord has not spoken. However, the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 Apostles for Latter-day Saints urge leaders and members not to advocate those personal theories in any setting or manner that would imply either prophetic or church support for those theories. And I'm going to interject here. So if you were to say, well, I'm a Mesoamericanist because Joseph Fielding Smith really believed in that. I mean, that's where I'm off base, where I'm trying to make some sort of authoritative claim that some authority in the church is telling me I need to believe that. That's off base, I think. All
Right.
parties, and here's the important part, all parties, Dave, should strive to avoid contention on these matters.
All
Yeah, all right.
right.
And here's an interesting one for me. In 1993, Office of the First Presidency sent this letter to FARMS, the old Foundation for Ancient Research Mormon Studies, now defunct. The church emphasizes the doctrinal and historical value of the Book of Mormon, not its geography. While some Latter-day Saints have looked for possible locations and explanations for Book of Mormon geography, because the New York Hill Cumorah does not readily fit the Book of Mormon description of Cumorah, there are no conclusive connections between the Book of Mormon text and any specific site. I recognize that's a good, 30 years ago already. Where did the time go? But the church, the LDS church, very wisely stays out of the fray because, as far as I'm concerned, they keep their eyes on the prize,
Right.
which is to preach the gospel and redeem the dead. That's what they're about. All right. So as I introduced this thing initially, what you expressed was basically what Neil Rapley said in his article about this. In general, there are three types of evidence: the so-called prophetic evidence, statements of Joseph Smith, and some of those are, well, we have to question all of them because they're historical, coming from either prophetic passages in the Book of Mormon or things said by Joseph Smith or another modern-day prophet. The
Okay.
second type of evidence is anthropological evidence, archaeological, cultural, linguistic, or even genetic data from ancient America, which both parties rely on that to some extent.
They do.
Number three, geographic evidence, the actual lay of the land, geologic, topographic, and hydrologic information, etc., which tends to be where the Mesoamericanists tend to lean.
Right.
So far, so good.
So far, so good. Making sense.
So
Even
as
to
we
a guy
talk
like
about
me.
these, as we talk about these prophetic statements, I'm going to digress just a little bit with this idea of the notion of official doctrine. And because all iterations of Mormonism come from the place where this principle was established, how to determine official doctrine, I think we all have buy into this to some extent. And I also think it cuts all ways with all parties, because I think
Right.
we're all guilty at one point or another of trying to elevate somebody's ideas, pet ideas and teachings as more than what it is. All right. What is official doctrine and how is it established? Church history reveals a clearly established procedure that has been carefully followed for over 180 years. Doctrine and Covenants 28:13 explains all things must be done in order and by common consent in the church by the prayer of faith. Since the church was founded in 1830, new doctrine has been accepted 6 times exactly. On every occasion, a 3-step process was followed to add official doctrine. It requires the approval of the first presidency, the concurrence of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and then it must be accepted in a sustaining vote of the entire membership. Only then is it binding on the membership of the church. The change will then be made to the body of accepted canonized scriptures, and then it gives those occasions when that happened. In the Bible, the Book of Mormon were officially accepted. Doctrine and
Okay.
Covenants, first 103 sections officially accepted. 1880, section 132. I'm sorry, additional 32 sections were accepted, along with the Pearl of Great Price.
I was gonna
1890,
say,
your favorite.
be careful. Michelle Brady Stone's going to come get you.
Official declaration. 1976, the church added 137 and 138, and 1978, the official declaration on priesthood, revelation on priesthood, race and priesthood.
Okay.
Also, now this is interesting to me. In 1921, the church removed, the LDS church, removed the lectures on faith from the Doctrine and Covenants with the explanation that they were never presented to the church as being divinely revealed scripture. It didn't follow that pattern. It was determined they simply did not measure up. On August 17th, 1835, when Joseph Smith was in Michigan, Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery presented the Doctrine and Covenants to a General Assembly to become a law unto the church, a rule of faith and practice, which did not follow the guidance for a new official doctrine. Now, this is also interesting. It surprises a lot of my LDS friends. There are 5 items that are often assumed to be official doctrine, but fail the above standard. Official talks and statements, official publications, official policy and procedures, books by general authorities and conventional wisdom. They are not official doctrine. They can be good doctrine. They can be solid doctrine. They can be wise doctrines. But the church is very particular about what it commits itself, marries itself to when it gives it official doctrine. And the reason the church does that is to protect itself. Anyway,
Okay.
does that make sense to you? Do you
That
have
makes
any
up.
pushback
Yep.
on
Nope.
that
That
stuff?
makes sense.
You know what's really funny about this website?
Hmm.
This is where all this stuff is listed and it's presented quite beautifully. StayLDS.com. Do you know who created that website and who still maintains it to this day? Your
I
good friend
believe
John.
his name rhymes with Don Jolin.
and he knows that he still maintains this.
Yep.
And to his credit,
Yep.
is that this is a critical thing for us to understand when we start talking about prophetic statements and opinions, even of the prophet Joseph Smith, about certain things in our lives. It's critical for us to understand what is canon and what is not.
Gotcha.
So we can elevate his opinion and pay heed to it, but not have to hold the church as a body to it. Now, how did Joseph Smith feel about this concept? What? I can't see that because of this banner. I don't know. Oh well. A contemporary of Joseph Smith stated, Edward so-and-so, I have heard the prophet say that he did not claim perfection, but possessed human weaknesses. We know this. He said, when I speak as a man, it is Joseph only that speaks, but when the Lord speaks through me, It is no more Joseph Smith who speaks, but it is God, and let all Israel hear. I think we know that, right? We've heard that. Not every word that comes out of his mouth was the word of God. And that, or as I've heard you say about Brigham Young, I don't worship Brigham Young,
Right.
right? And my favorite example of this concept, uh, Jesse W. Crosby tells us what Joseph Smith told him. Joseph Smith said, when some other brethren, I once went to, oh, with some other brethren, Jesse said, I once went to the prophet and asked him to give us his opinion on a certain public question. The request was refused. He, Joseph, said that when he ventured to give his private opinion on any subject of importance, his words were often garbled and their meaning twisted and then given out as the word of the Lord because they came from him. That
And
is
that right
so,
there is why I will never start a branch of the restoration, because that is entirely too much headache to worry about.
I love that. And I don't know when he said this. I assume it was later on in his life, toward the end, that he had learned this
Oh,
hard lesson. And what I find interesting is that when the Saints went to Utah, to Deseret, Brigham Young in particular, he just let fly
yep.
because he was such a great extemporaneous speaker, and he was very comfortable speculating from the pulpit. And speculations are really quite extraordinary. But as far as the Latter day Saint leadership today goes, they are super careful
Yeah.
for that very reason. Anyway,
Well,
so all of this stuff, go ahead.
People forget in Brigham's day, he can just let it rip, right? Because
Yeah, yeah.
they're not running any longer, right? They're like,
Right.
we're out of the United States. You know, it's only friendlies here at the moment, right? I mean, there's he can let it rip. He can talk about some things that Joseph probably told him that he just couldn't talk about in
Yeah,
Illinois or
that's true.
certainly Missouri, right? He's got a blank check.
Do you imagine? Because Brigham Young was prophetic. He saw the future
Oh,
in
yes,
many
he did.
respects. But I'll bet you anything he would be surprised back then to know how his words are spread around today. I'll bet because he
Oh,
was out in Utah all by himself. I'll bet he'd freaked out. Man, I probably shouldn't have said that about the
oh,
moon, or
oh. Well, and here's part of the problem, right? We take it for granted today. So, good buddy of mine, shout out to Tom. He said something once in priesthood right after I moved here. He said, yeah, look at Dave. I mean, he says things that are going to be on the internet forever. And I'm like, let's not talk
you
about that
know.
anymore, right? Like you're freaking me out. Let's not do that anymore.
Uh,
But he's right, right? And now the benefit to that is that Ken, they get to hear our voice inflection. They get
that's
to see
true.
our facial expressions, right? So if I say something like I just did about the professor in Gilligan's Island, no one's taking me serious, right?
Right, right.
You don't get that from the written word. Sometimes you can deduce it, but other times it gets a little dicey, you know. And so I've often wondered, like, oh man, I said that, and now they're reading that, and they don't get that I was joking around or something, right? Um,
Yep,
and so yeah, you got to be super careful here. You got to look at the source. You got source says, right? I'm a guy that typically says unless it's a direct journal entry, I need two or three sources that say relatively the same thing before I'm willing to attribute it to Joseph.
exactly. Amen. Which brings us, I mean, that was a nice segue into this concept of what's called historical method. In academia, if we're quoting a source, there are not all historical sources should be evaluated equally. It depends on at least these four things. Number one, the closer a source is to the event which it supports or purports to describe or chronologically, the more one can trust it to give an accurate historical description of what actually happened. So and so told us what Joseph Smith did 50 years earlier is not going to hold much water, as opposed to he wrote this down the day it happened, kind of.
Right.
Number two, a primary source is more reliable than a secondary source, which is more reliable than a tertiary source,
Yep.
and so on. Do you know what you call uh, uh, a third hand witness in court? Hearsay.
Yep. I was gonna
And
I was gonna
oh
say
boy,
not evidence.
right, right. The anti-Mormons love those tertiary sources
Yep.
because they'll say anything,
Yep.
especially if your name is William McClellan. Oh yeah, 50 years after the fact,
Right.
Joseph Smith's wife Emma, his widow, decided to confide in me the most personal thing that she would never confide in anybody. The guy, me, William McClellan, who stole all the bedding out of her house when she was trying to give it to Joseph in Liberty Jail. I mean, who's going to
Right.
believe that?
Why?
Everybody who wants to attack the church. All right. Number three, the tendency of a source is its motivation for providing some kind of bias. Is it a hostile source? Is it a source that's a little too friendly? Joseph Smith could do no wrong,
Right.
bias. And number four, if, as you were just saying, if two independent sources agree on a matter, the reliability is enhanced. If the source is different from one another, we have to start asking questions. Anyway, we refer to that as the historical method. So on with the prophetic evidence. And I start here with Cumorah. In my view, that's the Heartlanders' stake in the map. That the hill in Palmyra that we refer to as the hill Cumorah is the same hill Cumorah that is mentioned in the Book of Mormon. And it wasn't until fairly recently that it occurred to me that a lot of members of the church they do stake their testimony because they were raised with the concept that the hill in Palmyra is the hill of records, is the hill Cumorah. And for any Latter-day Saint or any Mormon of any kind to suggest that it's not, that that's sacrilege. We're denying the faith. So here are some things. Well, by the way, the reason I'm starting here instead of
Sure.
jumping in with the Mesoamerican model, and I hope it's okay,
Yeah, absolutely.
is because I fully expect the majority of people who I hope will listen to this are Heartlanders. And I know they're devout people, good people, friends, right?
Sure.
And if they're going to give any space whatsoever to what I want to present about the Mesoamerican model, I have to be able to first give them a reasonable alternative to some of the things they believe about the Heartland model. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
what I want to present here at the beginning are some reasonable explanations why Ken Peterson, at least, uh, even though I even though I know the same things they know about the Heartland model, but I don't buy into it. Right. So that's what this is about.
Okay.
From the Fair Latter day Saint website, the Book of Mormon does not state that the plates of Mormon were buried in the hill Cumorah, speaking of the hill in Palmyra. In fact, the Book of Mormon states that the plates were not buried in Cumorah at that time, but were given to Moroni to safeguard until it came time for them to be put in their ultimate place of deposit. What do I mean by that? So this is Mormon chapter 6, verse 6. And it came to pass that when we had gathered in all our people in one to the land of Cumorah, which is there, this is the gathering for the great last battle. Behold, I, Mormon, made this record, and he's talking about the gold plates, the
Right.
abridgment, right, out of the plates of Nephi, and hid up in the hill Cumorah, side of the great and last battle, which is the same as the hill Ramah for the Jaredites, all the records which had been entrusted to me by the hand of the Lord, which were quite a few, save or except it were these few plates which I gave unto my son Moroni. And what plates were those? The gold plates. So Moroni, chapter 6, verse 6, he says, I put all the other plates in the cave in Cumorah, and I took these gold plates, the abridgment, to become the Book of Mormon, and I gave them to Moroni.
Okay.
What did he do with all the other ones? Sealed them up in the cave, left them there.
Hmm.
And then everybody got killed, including Mormon. And Moroni did what? He took the gold plates with him wherever he went, and he fled for his life. So what the Book of Mormon specifically does not teach is that the gold plates, at least at that time, were not deposited in the original Hill Cumorah in the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
All right. This demonstrates that the burial plates of the rest of the plates from the people of Nephites were buried at the hill where the Nephite destruction took place, the actual ancient Cumorah. So far, so good?
I think so. So what you're saying here is that there's nothing that says Joseph went to the Hill Cumorah in Palmyra to get the records. Is that what I'm understanding?
Joseph Smith never, but from what I've read and studied, he never called it Hill Cumorah. The angel Moroni never identified it. Now we're talking about the hill in Palmyra, right? The
Right.
angel Moroni never called it Hill Cumorah. Oliver Cowdery was one of the first. Oh, W. Phelps was the first in 1833. And then in 1835, we have an account of Oliver Cowdery calling it Cumorah.
Okay.
And then
So,
it became tradition to call it Cumorah by everyone else.
mhm.
And then in the Doctrine and Covenants, we have a mention, and from Cumorah, uh, uh, the voice of the angel from Cumorah.
Right.
But yeah,
So, okay. So let me push back on this a little bit here as I'm thinking about this. So, for the last almost 200 years now, we've had this thought that the hill Cumorah is the hill situated by where Joseph lived, and we made the assumption that's where he went and got the plates, based off of something that was said by W. Phelps and Oliver Cowdery. Is that your assertion?
not quite. They began to have questions about if that was actually the hill Cumorah, uh, even in the 1800s, as early as the late 1840s, when the Stevens accounts came out, some of the very first records of the Mesoamerican cultures. So it, I will say, I think I was one of them. I think most of us grew up believing two whoppers about
Okay.
the Book of Mormon, and most Latter-day Saints in Joseph Smith's time, including Brigham Young and others, believed that the geography of the Book of Mormon was hemispheric. I mean, who didn't? First time you read the Book of Mormon, narrow neck of land, narrow neck of land. Aha! It's Panama.
Okay.
The land southward is South America. Boo! The land northward is the good guys. That's us. That's the land of the Nephites and the land northward and all desolation and all that sort of stuff. It seemed really obvious to us.
Okay.
And it was Oliver Cowdery, for example, who said Lehi landed in Chile.
Right.
But then later, but their ideas did change. Brigham Young even later said that Central America was where the Nephite civilization was as time went on.
Okay.
Suffice to say, in my view, I don't think any of them knew exactly where anything was. How could they? They didn't know anything about ancient America, really. So,
So let me ask you this: why does Phelps make the assertion? Because you asked me to push back here a little bit, so I'm going to push back. Why does Phelps and Cowdery both say that it's that hill that was called Cumorah by where Joseph lived? Neither of those men were from that area, right? They wouldn't be familiar with that particular hill. Phelps, I think, is born in New Jersey. Cowdery, I think, comes in from traveling and meets Joseph. But by the time he's his scribe, aren't they in Pennsylvania translating it?
well,
So it seems like just pushing back here, it would seem like a far stretch for them to name Cumorah if Joseph hadn't been the one that said, "Yeah, I got him out of that hill over there." That hill back where I used to live called Cumorah. Do you see what I'm saying?
yeah, yeah. So the assumption is that because they believed it, Joseph Smith must have said it to them. But that has to be remain an assumption because we have nothing, no
Okay.
record of Joseph Smith, to my knowledge,
Okay.
actually calling that. Now, of course, they would know the account of him retrieving the record from the hill.
Right.
Moroni put it, and I would imagine they would make that assumption for the same reason they assumed the hemispheric model of Book of Mormon geography.
I guess my point
which
is though,
Heartlanders don't believe that either.
right. I guess my thought would be, however, they wouldn't know about the Hill Cumorah unless someone who had intimate knowledge of that area told them about it, because they both encounter Joseph Smith after he's left that area. Do you see what I'm saying? They weren't familiar
Well, yeah, I mean, they would certainly know Cumorah from the record itself, from the Book of Mormon, and would
from
revere the hill.
the record,
Yeah.
right? And so when Joseph goes to collect that record, right? I can imagine the only way I could think that those two would even make an association, even know that there was a hill called Cumorah out by where he lived, was if Joseph said, "Yeah, there was this hill called Cumorah, and that's where I went and got the plates." Because they're not going to have the same access to information that we have today, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
I'm just throwing things out there. You asked me to push back a little bit here, Ken. I don't want to have this be anything too heated,
Dave, stop apologizing. Punch,
but
baby.
but
Go. You go.
but I'm having a hard time understanding how people who aren't from that region would be able to label that hill Cumorah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Um, it seems like well, they made lots of assumptions about lots of things
Sure,
in because of the ignorance of their understanding of the ancient inhabitants or any history of the American continent at all. So I and I also allow, because we don't have any record of him saying that, Joseph Smith,
right.
that it's also possible that he did. But what we also know is that later in life he was open to other options.
Sure.
Probably, like I say, probably because they were all, and I may get in trouble for saying this. I don't believe they understood the context for the book, the historical context for the Book of Mormon better than we do today. I don't think it was possible for them to do that. We've had that book for over, well, for 195 years,
Hmm.
digitally and otherwise. And we've had some of the wisest and most inspired minds on earth study the book and give us all kinds of insights about the book. And we know more about ancient America than anyone ever has. Part of me says, why are we referring to people from the 1830s who knew nothing about ancient America to tell me how to perceive the history of this book? You know,
My
yes, he was the
knee-jerk
prophet.
reaction is
Yes, he translated it. Yes, but as we well know, there are things he translated he didn't even understand.
right.
Right.
Okay. So here we've I think we've established that Joseph never said on record that we have that he went and got those plates from the hill Cumorah just outside of Palmyra.
That's true.
Okay.
That's true. No, nowhere in any official statement or even an unofficial statement did Joseph Smith say, "This hill is where the great and last battle occurred for the Nephites and the Jaredites. This is
Okay.
Cumorah. This is Hill Rama." We don't, to my knowledge, we don't have that. Historical accounts of artifacts found at the site by farmers and so forth are only unsubstantiated folklore accounts. Even if true, the accounts show that the arrowheads that could be found were tampered with and carried away and sold. So there is nothing left but the accounts themselves, which are not archaeological evidence in themselves. And if arrowheads were found there, does that really prove that it was Cumorah? Arrowheads found at any location in the United States is an unremarkable thing to begin with, as they can be found all over the country in a great many sites. So even if things were found, still wouldn't prove much. So
Okay.
we so the argument is, if that's Cumorah, where are all the artifacts? The weapons, the remains, what have you? Uh, to our knowledge, I mean, we hear accounts, and you'll read them on the Firm Foundation, uh, Book of Mormon Evidence.com, the Meldrum site, that there were buckets of arrowheads, and yet there's no archaeological record. They have archaeological record of arrowheads and ancient Americans in further east in New York, but where Palmyra is, there's nothing. Hasn't been for for recorded history, modern history.
But couldn't that be something where people just picked them all up or cultivated the ground and
Yeah, I mean, it's
got rid of them?
possible, but I mean, not even one left. I mean, because they're farming and turning that soil all the time. So we, I, um, I'm a hopeless eternal skeptic,
Sure.
and anecdotal evidence doesn't go very far with me.
Okay.
Now we can talk about Zilf. You want to talk
Okay.
about Kimura some more? Or are we good?
I think we're good there. I just want to make sure I understand what your thought is that because we have no official statement from from Joseph saying, yeah, I went and got him out of that hill called Cumorah and Palmyra, that's in flux.
Well, number one, because Mormon chapter 6, verse 6 says all the other plates are buried in Kimura.
Okay.
And then Moroni took the gold plates and left.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So if that hill in Palmyra is the Kimura of the Book of Mormon, those records should all still be there.
Gotcha.
Part of the problem, the hill in Palmyra is what is known as a drumlin hill.
Right.
It's a big old pile of gravel. It's one of the biggest ones in the area that gets pushed up, was pushed up by the glaciers during the last ice age, pushed up this big gravel pile. And those drumlin hills don't have any caves because it's a pile of gravel. There's no cave system. And people have searched and sounded and looked. I mean, it hasn't ever been excavated, to be fair. That'd be kind of fun. But realistically speaking, it's there are no records in there. There's no cave system in there. Now there is that vision that Oliver Cowdery shared. Brigham Young also shared it. 6 people have shared the vision of the hill opening up and them seeing all these records in the Sword of Laban and the Liahona.
Right.
And I'm not discounting the vision. I just I know as a matter of fact that it's not in the hill. What
Okay.
does it mean? That they probably had a vision of the hill Cumorah from the Book of Mormon.
Okay. So did you see the episode I did with Rod?
I did a little bit, yeah.
Did you see the part where he showed the cavern that was found in that hill?
No.
Okay, there is a cavern that was discovered by some kid falling into it not that long ago, actually. Looks like it had been covered up. Kid was walking, fell into it, and it was deep. And it looked like it was man-made at some point.
Yeah, why don't more people know about this?
I don't know. He showed pictures on here.
Wow, I'd like, yeah.
Yeah,
I,
it's
I'm,
on.
I'm gonna I'm gonna have to go back and have a look
Yeah,
at that.
go back and look at it. I'll see if I can't find it and timestamp it for you and send it. But there was something there. I'd be curious to get your take on it. So that's the last thing on Kimura that I
Very
have.
good. Very good. By the way, Rod is I like him personally. I've never met him personally, but I've heard him on a number of podcasts, and he seems like a really good guy. And so
He
I don't want anybody, least of all him, to mistake me as,
no,
coming
no.
down on him.
Look.
But I do have a lot of questions for him. I mean, and
Sure,
that's
and
fair, as he would of me.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm sure yeah, no. And look, that's okay, right? We've got to get past this idea that if we disagree on something, we have to
Right.
be enemies. We
Right.
don't. This is one of
Right.
those things we should be willing to hash out together and even have good discussions and debate around
Amen.
and not split over.
Now here we talk. Zelf is a controversial character.
Hmm.
While marching to Zion's camp in 1834, Joseph Smith and the brethren visited many of the mounds, which Wilford would have speculated were flung up probably by the Nephites and Lamanites. In a letter to Emma, Joseph Smith said they had been wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon. That's what Joseph Smith said. Joseph even said they were picking up their skulls and their bones as a proof of its divine authenticity. The state of Illinois records this event as one of the first archaeological finds in the state. So,
Really?
I mean, yeah, it's a real thing.
For Illinois to do that? I mean, look, no offense to anyone living in Illinois, but nothing good comes out of Illinois, right? I mean, you got Oprah,
Come on
Capone,
now. Come on. It's a
Obama,
great place.
the Bears. Like they topped out with
The
who?
Bulls, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, yeah.
Let's first of all, I just want to talk about the plains of the Nephites very quickly. This is a
Okay.
wonderful first-hand account of Joseph Smith himself talking about the plains of the Nephites. Where are the plains of the Nephites discussed in the Book of Mormon?
I probably should have read up on all this. Enlighten me.
They're not.
Okay.
There are two other plains that are mentioned, but the plains of the Nephites are not mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So, what we and we can deduce whatever we want, I suppose. But to me, that means that Joseph Smith was talking about something that wasn't mentioned in the Book of Mormon.
Which means he had, as we've discussed before on here about Joseph Smith, he was operating on a different level, right?
I do believe he had revelation at that point,
Right.
and I don't doubt that where they were would be could be called the plains of the Nephites.
Okay.
But we'll talk more about that when we actually get to the geography point.
Okay.
Second paragraph, exactly who Zelph was or how his story relates to Book of Mormon events. Well, let me stop right there. There's a thought that I would like to interject in that what we do know about the Western Hemisphere is that the entire hemisphere was populated by Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Alaskan Indians, Chilean and Argentinians, and
Yep.
every place in between. They were everywhere,
Yep.
but in some small number for the most part, and nomadic in many, many parts. But the evidence of that alone tells us that Native American civilization, whatever that civilization was, we'll talk more about that, was everywhere. And as you rightly pointed out, there was trade occurring between certain North American regions and Central American regions,
Right.
and Central American and South American regions.
Right. Yeah, we're finding Michigan copper down with the Mayas, and I think it's the Mayans. Don't quote me on that, but someone down south of the border there, there's Michigan copper there, right? And it's copper that had to have been extracted beforehand. And look, this is where I'll tell you where I really feel on the whole thing, right? And I'm going to continue to push back through this a little bit, but I'm kind of a soft heartlander, right? For lack of a better term. And Ken and I discussed this before we jumped on. I tend to my hit what I know about people, we don't stay static for very long, right? There's always that party or that person is pushing the boundaries of exploration a little bit. And so this idea that if there's Michigan copper down south, given what I have studied in history and what history shows us is that when you have trade going on, you're also going to get cross pollination of ideas, principles, and theories. And so, even if it was as I believe, most of it took place up here, to say there weren't outposts of a thriving civilization down south, I don't think that would necessarily be accurate either.
Well, the book, and we need to keep in mind too that the Book of Mormon explicitly teaches that there were at least three massive northward migrations that were never heard from again.
Right,
I was talking about Hagoth because he got that cool name when he's on his ship, but there were people who went on foot into the land northward, never to return. Right.
right,
And I may as well bring it up here. There's the third great false assumption about the Book of Mormon is that the great and last battle at Hill Rama, the Jaredites killed every last Jaredite.
right,
That's like saying if the Democrats and the Republicans went after each other to kill each other in Washington, D.C., everybody in the United States would kill each other. And even in our day where we know what's going on, right? That would never happen. There would always be survivors. In the Jaredites' day, where they did not have any means of mass communication, all of these and the Jaredites, by the way, by the time that great and last battle happened, the Jaredites had been there almost
yeah,
2,000 years.
yep,
They were, they went everywhere. The evidence indicates that same genetic material from Alaska to Chile, with a couple of really
right,
weird outliers. But and just because the capital in the capital of the Jaredite capital killed each other doesn't mean every Jaredite on the Western Hemisphere ended up killing each other.
right,
It's one of those huge false assumptions that we jump at in the Book of Mormon because we didn't know any better.
right,
And clearly, archaeology, anthropology, history teaches us that Native Americans were here.
yep.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah, some of them to welcome Laman and Lemuel, and some not to welcome
Right.
the Nephites. But all
Yes.
right,
All right.
Exactly who Zelph was or how his history relates to Book of Mormon events, however, remains uncertain. In an account published as part of the history of Joseph Smith in 1846, after Joseph Smith's death, and this is where we get official, the so-called official account, the one that people are aware of.
Right.
Zelph was directly linked to the final battles fought between the Nephites and Lamanites in the 4th century. The visions, and I'm quoting it now, the visions of the past being opened to my understanding by the Spirit of the Almighty, I discovered that the person whose skeleton was before us was a white Lamanite. He was a warrior and a chieftain under the great prophet Omandagus, who was known from the hill Camorra, or Eastern Sea, to the Rocky Mountains. His name was Zelph. He was killed in battle by the arrow found among his ribs during the last great struggle of the Lamanites and Nephites.
Hmm.
So you understand why the Heartlander loves this, because it basically proves everything they're saying.
Right.
Despite it sounding like it was written in Joseph Smith first person voice, um, he left behind no direct statements about Zelph. No first person accounts from Joseph. Because this account mentions Camorra, the last great struggle between Lamanites and Nephites, some have taken this as a prophetic statement about Book of Mormon geography. However, when this account is compared against the manuscript history of the church and the earlier sources on Zelph, the explicit connections to Book of Mormon places and events become tenuous. Which is to say, I'm going to skip ahead for just a second. Here are the 5 original accounts, original second-hand accounts of that event. Excuse me. They're all very early. Heber Kimball's is the latest, but look at what they do not agree on. Which of those 5 accounts mentioned Hill Camorra? 1 out of the 5, only Wilford. Which of them mentioned the last battle? Only Heber C. Kimball. Which talked about the Nephites? None of them. Which talked about Zelph being a warrior? Everybody but Moses Martin.
Right.
That he was a Lamanite? Everybody but Moses Martin. Who said he was righteous? 3 of them said he was, 2 of them didn't say.
Interesting.
This is a very common practice at that time period, to take the journals, put an idea together, and whoever was in charge of the journal would, massage it to make it how they remembered it, right?
Sure.
Why would they remember it differently? It's hard to say. Was it a part of what was in their head that they were injecting? Hard to say. So number 1, none of the early accounts about Zelph written by people in Zion's camp mentions the Nephites. Furthermore, in the pre-publication manuscript written in 1842 and 43 under Joseph Smith's guidance and direction, and Nephites is crossed out. But it got in 1846 anyway. Number 2, the last great struggle, as with and Nephites, the word last is actually crossed out in the pre-publication manuscript prepared under Joseph Smith's direction. Thus, when reading the pre-publication manuscript without the crossed out phrases, we only find that Zelph, himself a Lamanite, was killed during a great struggle with the Lamanites. Number 3, Hill Camorra, once again, in the pre-publication manuscript, Hill Camorra is crossed out, and thus Onondagas is only said to be known from the Eastern Sea to the Rocky Mountains. So somebody injected.
Do we know who made the revisions on that?
No, I don't think there's any way to know that.
Interesting.
But it was, but those things that were crossed out were under Joseph Smith's direction while he was still alive. The printed publication was published after he was dead, so he wouldn't be able to correct that if he
Gotcha. Wanted. Okay.
Can you see the top of that? I can't see that. In some, blah, 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 blah. Can you read that?
In some, all details connecting Zelph to specific Book of Mormon places or events in the history of the church article are crossed out in the pre-publication manuscript and are poorly supported by primary sources.
So that's the contention with the Zelph statement. And as far as the historical method that we talked about, you'd have to take that statement
Right.
and it's tenuous. Then we talk about Zarahemla. On July 2nd, 1839, Joseph Smith and other church leaders visited the site of Zarahemla across the river from Nauvoo in question. The entry published in the history of the church reads as follows: spent the forenoon of this day on the Iowa side of the river, went in company with elders Sidney Rigdon, Hiram Smith, and Bishops Whitney and Knight, and others to visit a purchase lately made by Bishop Knight as a location for a town, and advised that a town be built there, and called Zarahemla. Referring to the settlement as Zarahemla before the March 1841 revelation is consistent with what other historical evidence showing the saints already referred to the site by that name. So because it's mentioned that, what do we hear from Cumorah? That's in, I think it's section 125, I forget right now. The fact that they were already calling it Zarahemla long before the section in the Doctrine and Covenants indicates that it was a tradition that they had begun at least as early as 1839. Going on, these early references to the name of the Iowa settlement previous to March 1841 indicate that the saints referred to it as Zarahemla long before the revelation in question. There is no indication in these early sources that this designation was based upon revelation, or even that it was Joseph Smith's idea. The purpose of the revelation was most likely to counsel the saints to gather at the appointed place and not, as the authors of the Heartland theory suggest, to reveal the ancient location of a Book of Mormon city. Again, what did he not say, or what did anybody not say?
Right.
This is the ancient city of, yeah. The saints did what they would often do, name places they lived after places mentioned in the Bible and the Book of Mormon. There's no compelling reason to associate the Iowa settlement with ancient Zarahemla.
And look, to be fair, and this is one point I'm willing to concede because I've heard this argument before. I don't think just because they named the place Zarahemla means that that's where it's at, right?
Yeah.
Look, there's a far west Utah. There's a bountiful Utah, right? And in no ways do I think that the Book of Mormon narrative takes place in Utah, right?
Right.
I don't see that.
Well,
And
the canal in my hometown is called the Sidon Canal.
right. And so there's no way that I'm willing to go out and call that definitive by any stretch of the imagination.
Then we talk about this issue. By the way, I think it's interesting what the other side calls their geography theory. What do they call it?
Heartland,
Why do they call it that?
because they think it takes place in the heartland of America,
To me, there's inherent bias in the name. It's
right?
not the heart. It's not the heartland to the Canadians, Mexicans, or Peruvians. It's the
Okay.
heartland to the people who are from there and who want it to be there. That's why they call it the heartland. I mean, if the Mesoamericans were smart, they'd call it the Mesoamerican Holy Land or something.
To be
It's
fair
better
though,
to.
Rod didn't live back there, and I think he's the one that coined the phrase, right?
Well, it's still America.
Okay. All right. So all right. I see where you're going there. You feel like that maybe that name adds some sort of
For me, yeah, it
nationalist
betrays a
fervor.
certain bias. Yeah, they want it to be there. Anyway, Joseph Smith, quote, speaking of the land of Zion, it consists of all North and South America, but that any place where the saints gather is Zion, which every righteous man will build up for a place of safety in his children, for his children. The redemption of Zion is the redemption of all North and South America. So the idea that the Book of Mormon or Joseph Smith or anybody else only thought the United States of America was the promised land, uh, I have to say that's an affront to every other American Latter-day Saint in the Western Hemisphere. The
Mm-hmm.
Peruvians believe Zarahemla's in Peru. Mexicans believe it in Mexico. You
Right.
know, I don't know what the Canadian saints believe. I don't know who they
They're
would.
waiting for the scripture that comes forward that talks about abundance of syrup, maple syrup. Then they can narrow it down.
Proponents of the so-called heartland interpretation claim that Joseph Smith's usage of such terms as this land, this continent, or this country indicated specialized usage that must and can refer only to territory within the United States. Contrary to that view, the historical evidence suggests that Joseph Smith never considered that. The question of the Book of Mormon geography was settled by revelation, and that those terms, as applied to the Book of Mormon, do not reflect a specialized usage, but refer to the land, continent, and country of America, meaning North and South America, not only the United States. The interest of Joseph Smith and other early Latter-day Saints in the remains of pre-Columbian culture accessible to them does not justify the claim that he believed or taught an exclusive United States geography, is my contention. All right. I do want to go ahead.
Let me push back here a little bit, because I'd like to get your interpretation then of the letter Joseph wrote, right? Because that is a pretty hardcore piece of evidence, because it's in his hand, right? There's no doubt.
Which letter are you talking about?
The one that he writes to Emma about coming over the plains of the Nephites.
Yeah, yeah.
So in your mind, what's your thoughts there when he calls that area the plains of the Nephites? Is he referring to... I would just like to get your idea about what it is you think he's saying there exactly.
John Clark was the first to actually publish, but he's not the first to come up with this idea.
Right.
Everybody recognizes that the Book of Mormon, even though it dealt with just the local, essentially their local culture and population.
Okay.
I mean, they had the land southward, the land northward. Beyond that, we don't know anything.
Right.
But it does explicitly state that there were at least 3 groups that left that area that they were concerned with, and all 3 of them went north and never came back. And as I said before, there were people everywhere. So assume, for the sake of discussion, that Zarahemla was in Mesoamerica. We'll talk more about that.
Sure.
And that there were people who were related to the Nephites or the Lamanites who went north and settled up north. There's no reason why that couldn't be the plains of the Nephites.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Anyway, that's referred to as the hinterland hypothesis.
Okay.
That even though the Book of Mormon, what we're talking about is not where other Nephites went. What we're talking about tonight is where Zarahemla was. Right. I mean, that's what we're really interested in, right? Okay. Where all that stuff happened, in the narrow neck of land and stuff.
Okay.
mtDNA mutations are measured by molecular clocks used to calculate age estimates of the different branches of the DNA tree. Currently, there are 5 different molecular clocks that have been proposed using all or a considerable section of the DNA genome. All 5 clocks provide close estimates for haplogroup X2A, indicating that it predates the Lehites' arrival to the Americas by several thousands of years. In reality, based on current DNA science and the lack of additional evidence, X2A cannot be linked to the Lehites. It's a completely different chronological era.
Okay.
I have to laugh when I see this picture. I'm looking at some of the Heartlander relics. Have you ever Googled Heartland relics?
I have not.
In preparation, I was Googling, just to get some photos and stuff. I'm not kidding you. The top 20 hits on Google were sites selling this stuff.
Replicas and that sort of thing.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
That it's become commercialized.
Right.
And the one right in the middle, the round one.
The Decalogue stone, yeah.
All right. I have a wonderful client who should go nameless. I was working at her house one day, and she comes out clutching this Decalogue stone replica and was telling me all about it and how excited she was. And she bought it, and she knew it was just a replica. She was holding it like a holy rosary. Well, and wanted to get me to hold it and see how I felt when I was holding it. And as politely as I could, I said, I'm one of those guys that believes that I don't buy into the Heartlander theory in its entirety, right?
Look,
and I was trying so hard to be nice. Anyway,
look, here's the thing. I'm a guy who thinks the Decalogue stone might have some chops, right? However, I'm not going to clutch a replica relic and treat it like it's a rosary or something, right? It's a replica.
So, beginning in the prophet's lifetime, the unfortunate creation and circulation of unproven artifacts, modern forgeries, and other hoaxes began. We know this to be true. Joseph String, or James String. And some have connected a few of these forgeries to the Book of Mormon or Latter-day Saint history specifically, while other falsified artifacts have been associated with the Book of Mormon indirectly. Is there a danger to this?
Oh yeah. I mean, look, if bad evidence is being passed around, right? It, that needs to be gotten out of the equation, right? Because we can't make any headway with with falsified information, right?
Well, and it casts a bad light on the real evidence, the good evidence.
Yes,
So
yes.
we're going to talk about each of these renowned relics. Kinderhook plates. Do you buy into them personally?
I'll be honest, I haven't done enough research on them myself to
These are
formulate.
one of the first ones they presented to him, trying to test if he could translate or not.
Right.
And people say, "Oh, he was hoodwinked." Did he ever publish anything? Did we worship the Kinderhook plates?
No,
No,
no.
no, he didn't. Uh, Allegedly had been excavated in the town of Kinderhook. Don't you want to live there? Illinois, and were brought to the prophet with hopes he could translate the engravings. Six small brass or bell-shaped brass plates, as you can see, that's the size.
Hmm.
For many years, Latter-day Saints thought the plates were authentic, even though one of the men involved in their discovery admitted they were fraudulent. Many years later, scientific study would demonstrate that the plates were in fact modern forgeries. This has been the position of the LDS Church ever since. The Michigan relics. I didn't know how many there were.
There were a
I was
lot.
trying to find some good pictures, and there are pictures of everything. There were hundreds of them. Another set of forgeries connected with Latter Saint history is the so-called Michigan relics, beginning in 1890. Hundreds of objects were made to appear as the remnants of a lost civilization. The artifacts were produced, buried, discovered, and marketed by James O. Scottford and Daniel E. Soper. For 3 decades, these artifacts were secretly planted in earthen mounds, publicly removed, and lauded as wonderful discoveries. They were really good at finding those things, weren't they? Many of these artifacts included clear depictions of biblical events such as creation, the flood, Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac, and the life of Christ. Because the Michigan relics allegedly evidence of Near Eastern presence in ancient America, they have drawn interest from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as well as the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Elder Talmage became interested. Talmage was a scientist in the artifacts. At one point, it was tasked by the first presidency to investigate their authenticity. Ultimately, as with most professionals at the time, Talmage concluded, after considerable scientific experiment and some detective work, that the artifacts were fraudulent. This conclusion continues to be the consensus among scholars from both
Mm.
inside and outside the church. That's the story of the Michigan relics.
And it's one of those things, Ken, where I'm like, there's enough out there that is very compelling. There's no need to falsify evidence, right?
Agreed.
No
Agreed.
matter which side you fall on. And look, I don't care what side people fall on. I really don't. It's not something I feel to be like, well, we can't hang with them. They're, Mesoamerican people, right? It's not in my wheelhouse. To be quite frank, it shouldn't be that should not be something you divide over, right?
Amen.
And
Amen.
I don't care where they come to, as long as they come to it honestly with good information.
Yep. The Newark Holy Stones. The artifacts known today as the Newark Holy Stones were allegedly discovered in 1860 by a man named David Wyrick at a site near Newark, Ohio. The artifacts consist of keystone, or a stone with Hebrew inscriptions on its four sides, the Decalogue stone, which includes a supposed image of Moses and Hebrew text of the Ten Commandments running along its sides, nested in a sandstone box, and a stone bowl. Almost immediately after their discovery, the artifacts were met with skepticism. Errors in the Hebrew text was one of the major red flags raised by experts who examined the stones. Despite continued attempts to authenticate the artifacts, skepticism has persisted among mainstream archaeologists down to the present. Where did when they were excavating it, I skipped this part. One of the guys who was assisting, I might have that confused with another. I've confused that with another stone, I think. This is the Decalogue stone in Los Lunas, New Mexico, a large flat stone covered with an abbreviated version of the Ten Commandments in a variant ancient Semitic alphabet called the Los Lunas Decalogue Stone or Commandment Rock. The first recorded encounter with the stone was in 1933 by the archaeologist Frank Hibben, although a plausible but unconfirmed sighting of the stone may have occurred earlier in the 1870s. The debate surrounding the stone is whether the Semitic inscription upon it is authentically ancient. While the inscription is carved in an ancient form of Hebrew, the identification of the carver remains a mystery. The archaeologist and linguist Cyrus Gordon accepted the authenticity of the inscription and argued that it was Old Phoenician Hebrew. This theory, however, has not gained widespread acceptance. Most scholars, including LDS scholars, regard the inscription as fraudulent. As with the Newark Holy Stones, problems with the language and preservation of the inscription have been raised. This is what I was thinking of, the Bat Creek Stone. Discovered in 1889 during a Smithsonian-led excavation of Native American sites near Bat Creek in Loudoun County, Tennessee. The artifact known today as Bat Creek Stone is a relatively flat, thin piece of ferruginous siltstone, approximately 11 centimeters long by 5 centimeters wide. On the stone is an inscription of about 8 characters written horizontally across the surface. In the publication of his field notes, the director of the excavation, Cyrus Thomas, declared the inscription on the stone to be beyond question letters of the modern Cherokee alphabet. Excitement over the stone increased when Cyrus Gordon published arguments that the inscription on the stone was actually ancient Hebrew and read for Judea or for the Judeans. According to Gordon, the inscription lends credibility to the idea that the ancient Jews successfully migrated to the New World. In recent years, the authenticity of this inscription has come under critical scrutiny. John Emert, Thomas' assistant, who was the one to actually excavate the mound where the stone was discovered, has been charged with forging of the characters on the stone by using available 19th century sources. Gordon's contention that the characters are authentic ancient Hebrew has likewise been challenged. While some have continued to defend the authenticity of the inscription, the Smithsonian itself now regards it as fraudulent.
Okay, I want to stop right there at that spot there, because there's something I'm seeing here, and this is part of my pushback with this when I do talk about this, is, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to throw all of archaeology under the bus. There is a school of there's kind of stuff that goes on in archaeology that to me appears funny. Okay. One is archaeology's been around for how long, Ken, as a discipline?
About 125 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So really. You're going to tell me that in 125 years we can be like, oh, we got this whole history of humanity thing figured out, right?
Right. Yeah.
And there has been resistance, more so in archaeology, I think, than in other disciplines, where when something comes up to upset certain models, those archaeologists circle the wagons and really do put those guys on an island, even when they come with credentials, right?
Yep.
And that's problematic because when things like this come up, I don't know who to trust, right?
Yep.
Because we see this in Clovis first, right? For years, the idea was, nope, the first people here were the people who were using Clovis points. Right. Well, the thing about that is that we now know that that's not the case, and even most archaeologists have had to wrestle with that, and that's good. When new evidence comes up, you should be able to change. The unfortunate thing I see, however, is that rather than consider the evidence, and even if you don't believe it, say, let's put it on a shelf and revisit this if more evidence comes to light, they tend to ridicule those who try to upset that narrative, right?
Yeah.
And so when we say things like, okay, so we have these archaeologists who've said this, and then later they've discredited it, we don't know where to go with that, right? And so how do you now, and this is an honest question for you, because you're a really bright guy, smarter than me. When you encounter stuff like that, how do you know how much weight to put on those modern archaeologists?
Well, the one thing I was going to point out, we've gone through all of the primary relics. Right. There's not a one of them that's a home run.
No.
I mean, they're all found under the same suspicious circumstances. And part of it, too, is finding it in situ, meaning, is this artifact found in the ancient setting, as part of the ancient settlement in the home or around the fire, or whatever it was. They always seem to be found, oddly enough, all by themselves somewhere that nobody can say exactly. And they can't prove that it was related to anything in the surrounding archaeological area. And that's one thing all of these relics we've talked about tend to have in common.
Okay.
Um, and I agree with you. The established authorities can sometimes be reluctant to accept new ideas, especially if they're outside the box. And you and I have had that discussion before. Um, the other thing that I have found is when the archaeological evidence or artifacts are so abundant that they're overwhelmingly, undeniably so. That's another matter.
Okay.
But what we see here are a quite varied bunch of collections, which, in terms of the artisanship, I mean, any Tom, Dick, or Harry could have scratched that on there. So, uh, to me, they just seem odd.
Okay.
And what's really odd is they all seem odd,
Okay.
and that no one has really known of any real authority. And we'll talk about some of that in a minute too. I I don't trust somebody. The appeal to authority fallacy is not something I am into.
No,
Oh,
and
so and
I
so,
don't.
so and so is an expert, so he must know better than you. Well,
Yeah,
that's not
and I'm not
necessary.
saying you were doing that. I don't want you to think I was
Oh no,
making
no, I
that
don't. I don't.
accusation. Okay.
No, thank you. I don't believe that at all. Well, we'll talk some more about that. Um, the other issue is, um, in identifying Book of Mormon lands, or where Zarahemla was and that sort of thing. We need to find some sort of archaeological evidence, anthropological evidence of the peoples that really were there during that time period. The Heartland model relies on the Hopewell and the earlier Adena civilizations,
Hmm.
and there are issues with those. First of all, the spread of the Hopewell culture was from north to south, not from south to north, like the Book of Mormon says that they did. Um, a vital aspect of the Book of Mormon is virtually absent in Meldrum's model, the location of the Jaredites. The Adena are the culture that preceded the Hopewell, but the
Right.
important fact is that they preceded them in the same area. Remember, the Book of Mormon, they actually overlapped for a bit,
Right.
right? In the land northward and the land desolation where the Jaredites were, there was some overlap for almost 200 years.
Right.
Um, the Book of Mormon requires that the Jaredites not be in the same area, but rather in the lands north of the Nephites and the Lamanites. And the Adena, that's not the case. The limited North American model Jaredite problem is most obvious when the archaeology around the hill Cumorah is investigated, since Hill Rama of the Jaredites is the Cumorah of the Nephites. Then we should find archaeological Jaredites in that region. Archaeologist John Clark notes a dilemma for those seeking remnants of Book of Mormon peoples around Cumorah if the New York hill from which Joseph retrieved the plates is equated with the Book of Mormon last battle site of Cumorah Rama. The archaeological record of the New York area seems quite misleading when one looks at the sites that have been radiocarbon dated. There is a huge gap in time wherein there is practically no data. Surprisingly, almost nothing is dated within the time period 500 BC to AD 400, the period of the Nephites. So in Upper New York, around Palmyra, that area, there was nothing happening there, according to archaeology currently. They radiocarbon dated stuff. So those are issues. Specifically speaking of the New York area, Clark goes on, as to cultural practices, the Book of Mormon describes for all its peoples, even the Lamanites, a sedentary lifestyle based on cereal agriculture with cities and substantial buildings. Thus, we should be looking for city dwellers, permanent populations, kings, farmers, and grains, like in the Book of Mormon. These should start in the third millennium before Christ and persist at least until the fourth century after his death. There should be some climax and nadir moments in developments, and these should occur in specific places on the landscape. New York lacked cities and cereal agriculture until after AD 1000 and is thus not the place. We are not missing evidence of Great Lakes peoples that can find it over there, their settlement patterns or subsistence practices for the time periods under consideration. These are reasonably well known for each period from a variety of evidence. They simply do not fit the specifications. The precise region in which we should find evidence of Jaredites with large cities, which can be supported only by extensive agriculture, shows no evidence of any cities and no evidence of a green crop capable of sustaining the Book of Mormon populations at the limited North American candidate site. By the way, John Clark, uh, anthropologist, does not work at BYU, in case anybody has BYU issues.
So as far as that goes, we do know that oftentimes, and we know this even about Native Americans, we certainly know it about the Egyptians, right? We know that Moses was a guy who actually existed, but we don't find a lot in Egypt talking about Moses because they tried to scrub it, right? Could we be dealing with something similar around Cumorah?
Well, I suppose anything is possible. But if I'm hearing John Clark right, it's not that there's no mention of the Jaredites and Nephites, it's that there's nothing at all.
But don't you
No
find that a
structures.
little odd in that one section? I mean, it's not like it's an unfertile plain, right?
Well, who would go to the trouble of scrubbing square miles, hundreds of square miles of stuff? I mean, who would do that and why?
You know,
I mean,
I would think if you know, if we just take a great battle, for example, I would imagine people would be picking stuff up, right? I mean, look, metalworks weren't exactly plentiful up in North America, right? During that
correct.
time. As far as we know, it was the Nephites and the Lamanites who had them. I would assume they would have picked up a lot of that stuff to use it later.
I suppose that's a possibility. Sure.
Right. Just a thought, just throwing it out there, right? Do
No,
what you
I appreciate that. Now, we're done with that part of the presentation, unless there are things you want to discuss.
nope,
And
that's
let me
good.
just say the that as I was putting all this together and thinking about that and the Heartlander perspective from their prophetic evidence to the relic evidence to leaning on the Adena and the Hopewell, there isn't a single one of those evidences, in my view, that is rock solid. They're all tenuous,
Sure,
all of them,
sure.
and that's not a good place to start. Anyway,
Look,
going on
and
with
I want to be clear up front. I'm not sure there is a smoking gun, right? I hope someday there is, whether that's North or South America. I'll hop on that wagon, right? You show me
oh
something that says, something like, "Hey, the Savior was here at these dates at this time, and this is the Temple Bountiful." I'm gonna be like, "Cool, I'm on board," right? I don't care if
well,
it's in Central America.
well, you're going to get that tonight.
Ooh, that's a
By
bold
the way,
claim.
the first part of this, as necessary as I thought it was, I don't like doing that.
I know you don't. I
I
know
don't
you
like
don't.
being the naysayer.
I know you
I
don't.
so this is where it gets fun for me.
Okay.
The geographic evidence, which is where the Mesoamericans really shine. But and I have to acknowledge this man. The Mesoamerican theory on Book of Mormon lands is based really entirely on this man's life and his work, John Sorensen.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, as Nibley was to Egypt, this guy is to Central America, correct?
That is exactly right.
Okay.
Exactly right. He lived almost to be 100. It was close, 97.
Ooh.
An American anthropologist, a scholar, and an author. He first performed archaeological work in Mesoamerica while pursuing a master's degree at BYU. From January to June 53, he was involved in the New World Archaeological Foundation's initial field work in the state of Tabasco in Mexico. So that's half a century
It's a
of
lot.
work. Sorensen held a PhD from the University of California, so he wasn't an inbred, BYU person. He began teaching. He began teaching at BYU. I mean, he and Nibley have been accused of not being real scholars, and those people are ignorant of their publications, what
Sure.
they've done
Sure. I would have a hard
outside
time.
of the church, right?
Yeah, I would look, whether you agree with him or not, Sorensen finds a lot of things that are compelling, right? That you have to account for.
Yeah, too much, too much. So he held. So let's see. He later established the university's anthropology department at
Mm.
BYU. He also served as head of social sciences for General Research Corporation based in Santa Barbara, California, and was the founder of Bonneville Research Corporation. For a time, he served as the editor of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. He authored, read that top line for me.
You
He
bet.
authored or co-authored some.
200 books and articles, including Mormon's Codex, an ancient American book.
Stop right there. This is Mormon's Codex. This was his last publication,
Nice.
2013.
Nice.
This is the culmination of his life, and this is so dense you just can't believe it. Anyway, let's see. An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, 1985, and that was the first time his published theory of Mesoamerican limited geography was put forth in that book, published in a book form. He'd been working on it prior to that. Transoceanic culture contacts between Old World and New Worlds in pre-Columbian times, comprehensive annotated bibliography, images of ancient America, visualizing Book of Mormon life, Mormon's map, the world trade and biological exchanges before 1492. While being a proponent of the history of the Book of Mormon, Sorensen also attacked the poor scholarship that some have used in defending the Book of Mormon. Apparently, he was brutal, not mean, just very exacting. I knew somebody who used to go home teaching to his house. He was
All
like
right.
the deacon or the priest, and he knew that if he wasn't prepared, Sorensen was going to ask him about it.
Oh,
He was also the father of 8 children, all boys, had one adopted daughter, 23 grandchildren, 10 great grandchildren, and served as bishop. I love this last statement here. It'll remind you of Nibley. The leading Mayanist of his generation, Michael Coe, he wrote the Bible on the Maya, refused to engage John Sorensen at conferences because he was too formidable.
ooh.
Coe has heaped praise on Sorensen in, of all places, a Mormon Stories interview, where he says that Sorensen is a friend and declares him the leading researcher on paradigm shifting research on pre Columbian transoceanic contact, which Coe admits he finds persuasive.
Wow.
Coe came out and said some pretty ignorant things about the Book of Mormon, and we don't have time to here and now, but John Sorensen wrote him a public letter and just ripped him a new one. Just slaughtered him with the established archaeological evidence that had been discovered.
You know,
So,
and I suppose this is a good place to point out, right? Whether you are somebody who um adheres to the Heartland model or the Mesoamerican model or someone who's in between, understand you are on the fringes, right? You're not going to get a lot of archaeologists willing to line up with you and say, "Oh yeah, the Book of Mormon, that's 100% actual," right? We're all on the fringes in this. So let's keep that out, get that out there.
well, it's funny to me too, because at this point in time, and before his death, Sorensen was pointing this out. When the Book of Mormon was published, less than 15% of its archaeological claims could be verified by secular science.
Right.
Today, it's at 97%. At 20 years ago, it was at 75%. And when Sorensen was talking about it, it was up to like 90%. And so they kept saying, but it keeps trending more and
Oh,
more toward to 100%, which tells you what about the book,
it's a true
you know?
record.
Yeah, and we'll see some more of that as we go on. Practically since the Book of Mormon was published, its geography. Well, one last thing I want to say about John Sorensen. Every single Mesoamerican believer today, regardless of the particular model, owe their beginnings to John Sorensen.
Right.
He was the originator of the whole thing, and to this day is unsurpassed in terms of the level of detail. I learned something today about him that I could not believe.
What's that?
I'll probably be giving it away too soon, but what he believes to be the waters of Mormon, right? During the time of Christ, the city that was on the shores of the waters of Mormon was swallowed up by the water,
Right.
Jerusalem. He said in 19 or around 1980 that he believed that they would discover a submerged city in this lake on the southern shores of this lake, which I'll talk about and show you pictures of later.
Okay.
10 years later in 1990, they found one.
Mm.
He predicted it 10 years ahead of time.
Wow.
That's good, baby.
Yeah.
Practically since the Book of Mormon was published, its geography has been the subject of discussion and debate. John L. Sorensen, one of the foremost students on the subject, identified over 600 passages relevant to geography. Cross-referencing Sorensen's work with that of John Clark's, Randall Spackman determined that there are upwards of 1,000 passages of potential geographic significance.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, we've already said we're not basing our testimonies on geography,
Right.
but I have to ask the question. Clearly, geography was important to the Book of Mormon writers.
Right.
I mean, they went to great lengths to point out their geographies. And they were very meticulous about it and terribly consistent. I'll show you some pictures about that. But why? Why was the geography so important to Mormon and Moroni and everybody? Because it was real.
Right.
Well, how else are you going to
Right.
describe what you're doing? All right.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point.
All right. Let's dispense with the hemispheric model. We're going to talk about why both the Heartlanders and the Mesoamericanists uh, settled into what's called the limited geography model.
Okay.
The hemispheric model, if you go from Alaska to Chile, is 8,000 miles. New York to Peru is almost 3,500 miles. As we'll discover in these accounts, there were armies marching from city to city in not years' times, but in weeks and days, right?
Right.
And most especially with the Limhi party, who had gone south to inherit their land, the lands of the first inheritance. And then they tried to go back to Zarahemla, but got lost, went past Zarahemla, went clear up to the land of desolation, where they found the 24 gold plates and all that sort of stuff, and then came back and had Messiah translate them. That didn't take them years. That took them weeks.
Right.
You can't go 3,500 miles in that short of time.
No.
And here's one of the things I meant, and no insult to the original saints who were reading the Book of Mormon for the first time. They thought simplistically was a hemispheric model because they hadn't done any critical thinking about the events yet. And now that we
Right.
have, it's abundantly clear to us that it could not possibly have been hemispheric. Nor could the Isthmus of Panama have been the narrow neck of land. Look how long it is. Look how narrow it is. How could you get lost going through that? Right?
Right.
So, theories of how Nephite lands relate to an actual map of the Western Hemisphere have varied vastly in scale. Where one person has separated a certain city from another by 1,000 miles, another may assign only 10. The
Mm.
scale of the lands obviously make a difference on how we read the Book of Mormon account. What did Mormon believe the distances were as he authored the history? Did he make enough statements on this subject to allow us to establish an intelligent picture of how big or how little the lands of Zarahemla or Nephi were? Mormon furnished us with a number of key pieces of information from which we can establish distances. And now this is John Sorensen at work. The journey of Alma the First's people, and it gives the references. It didn't take them years. Limhi's explorers' expedition to the land northward, movements in the Amalekite War, Alma II's circuit of cities preaching repentance. That happened pretty fast in like a month's time. The wars in the borders by the East Sea and in the southwest quarter, the land of Nephi is described in the Xenophite account, and that the sons of Messiah II, and the last wars between the Nephites and the Lamanites gives us very definite timescales of how long it took them to get places. The actual distance a person can go in one day varies greatly according to setting, individual capacity, mode of travel. Persons have been known to travel over 100 miles per day by foot with some regularity. And of course, if one went down a river in a canoe, an even greater distance could be traveled. Such variables prevent us from establishing a definite length for the line at the neck. But a range of figures between 60 and 125 miles can be argued as reasonable for the day and a half's journey. So he's trying to determine the width of the narrow neck between 60 and 125 miles.
Right.
He gives this very important qualifier. Recall that the narrower one makes the neck, the more difficult it is to explain how Limhi's explorers failed to realize that they had passed through it. They didn't even know. If they had
Mm.
known it was the narrow neck of land, they would have known to turn around.
Right.
Right. So it had to be wide enough they could still get lost in it. So, and this is a little bit nitpicky, but this is critical to understanding the limited geography. Crucial information comes from the account of the exploring party's Xenophite King Limhi sent to locate Zarahemla. They consisted of 43 of his most diligent men. So it wasn't a group of people and flocks and stuff. It had been 2 generations since the fathers had come from Zarahemla, so they themselves had not been there. And tradition apparently did not furnish firm information about the route they should follow to reach Zarahemla. I heard a very interesting hypothesis from Brant Gardner, a wonderful LDS scholar, which I'm going to present in a moment, why they got lost. And traditionally, apparently, did not furnish firm information about the route they should follow to reach there. The explorers wandered for many days before discovering extensive ruins. So they were in the land southward, went past Zarahemla, went into the land northward, and it took them many days. That's not thousands of miles. It's hundreds of miles at most.
Right.
These ruins turned out to be in the land desolation of the Jaredites, where there the party came upon corroded artifacts and the gold plates on which the last Jaredite prophet Ether had written his account of that people's history and extermination. The explorers then backtracked to the city of Nephi, their homeland, bearing Ether's record and a few Jaredite relics as proof of their story. What is remarkable to us now is their conclusion that the remains they found had been left by the inhabitants of Zarahemla. They thought they were in Zarahemla and everybody had been killed.
Mm. Oh, okay.
Who they supposed must somehow have been destroyed. We now understand the exploring party had traveled all the way into the land northward to within a few miles of the hill Rama. How far had they traveled in miles? What distance can we infer it was from the city of Nephi to the place where Ether left the plates? That would give us the length of the Nephite
Right.
area, if we can identify that. Surely they would have known from their grandfather's traditions approximately how far it was to Zarahemla. So if we put ourselves in their sandals, we probably would have to begin to wonder, after the estimated number of days had passed, just how much farther northward to press on. I can imagine them going on for perhaps twice as many days as the tradition told them it would take to get to Zarahemla, but not a lot more. It wouldn't have gone a month over, right? We
Okay.
know that the Nephite party was separated from Zarahemla by less than 200 miles, so it seems improbable that those diligent men would have pressed northward much more than double that distance without arguing among themselves about turning back. It looks from this incident like the final Jaredite battlefield was not much more than 400 airline miles from Nephi. The
Okay.
length of the kingdom, land desolation to the land of the first inheritance, 400 miles. And that's how Sorensen gets at that, at least from that instance. In
Which
Mormon's mind,
with the idea that they could travel about 100 miles a day, you're talking a 4 days journey.
yeah. Well, and then they took more days than that, probably because if it was 2 weeks to Zarahemla, they went longer than that. So,
Right.
and especially depending if they're going from the land of the first land of Nephi to Zarahemla, they went through that narrow strip of wilderness, which apparently was
Right.
quite difficult and was a highland because they would go down into the river valley of Zarahemla. So it was not an easy way, not an easy path.
Gotcha.
In Mormon's mind, the scene of Nephite, Lamanite, and Jaredite activities was of limited size. Main lands, minor lands, mountain ranges, plains, valleys, rivers, and oceans are all referred to in a manner that indicates that Mormon not only knew about these geographical elements from the records of his ancestors, but he knew much of the scene personally and intimately. Had been there. The dimensions are small, although hardly tiny, the promised land in which the Nephites' history played out was on the order of 500 miles long and over 200 miles wide, according to Mormon's mental map, according to John Sorensen. Since over 600 passages are, this is, John Clark makes this. This is probably the most exciting thing about this study for me. Finding a real world location that matches technically counts as hundreds of correspondences. And I would argue more than that. Archaeologist John Clark says this: the Book of Mormon account is remarkably consistent throughout. There's no question what they're talking about geographically. They
Hmm.
always know. Over 600 times. Boy, that Joseph Smith was a genius. We notice that the configuration of land, seas, mountains, and other natural features in Mesoamerica are a tight fit with the internal requirements of the text. It is important to stress that finding any sector in the Americas that fits the Book of Mormon specifications requires dealing with hundreds of mutually dependent variables. So rather than counting on a credible geography as one correspondence, it actually counts for several hundred. The probability of guessing reams of details all correctly is zero.
Okay.
Or to put it in my words, the Book of Mormon gives us so many details, between 600 and 1,000 details about the geography of Book of Mormon lands. To actually find a land that it matches perfectly is practically zero,
Right.
unless it's real.
Right.
I love this. It's so detailed that finding a place that matches perfectly is going to be near impossible. The lakes have to be in the right place, the rivers have to be in the right place, the seas, all of that. So, John Clark gave us a drawing from scripture, what the Book of Mormon describes as the geography of the lands of the Book of Mormon. Number one is the narrow neck, which separates the land northward from the land southward, and was flanked by the East Sea and the West Sea. So far, so good.
Yep.
Nephite and Lamanite lands occupied at least 3 times as much western coastline as eastern coastline. The west coast was longer. The eastern wilderness was much wider and lower than the western wilderness, but not nearly as wide as the southern wilderness. The city of Nephi, the land of the first inheritance, was in a highland valley. Zarahemla was in a large river basin that always moved down to Zarahemla and up to Nephi.
Okay.
The river Sidon flowed northward through Zarahemla. The waters of Mormon was probably a highland lake of significant size because it swallowed up at least one city.
Right.
Zarahemla was surrounded by Nephite fortifications. The city of Nephi was 3 weeks' travel south from Zarahemla and near the waters of Mormon. The city of Bountiful was north of Zarahemla and near the narrow neck. It was about 5 days' travel from Moroni and guarded the route to the land northward. Cumorah, also called Ramah, was near the eastern sea, not very far north of Bountiful. Those are pretty specific
Right.
requirements. Here's what gets really, finding the right geographical references is one thing, but we have a way to have the law of witnesses apply here. Not only does it have to fit geographically, it's going to have to fit anthropologically, archaeologically, and geologically, which the Book of Mormon also gives us piles of. So we're not talking about 600 or 1,000 requirements. We're talking about thousands
Right.
of requirements.
Okay.
Cultural requirements. Number one, cities, major cities. 2, towers. 3, agriculture, massive agriculture. 4, metallurgy. 5, formal political states. 6, organized religion. 7, idolatry. 8, crafts. 9, trade. 10, writing. 11, weaponry. 12, astronomy. 13, calendar systems. 14, cement. 15, wheels. And I've added these last two. 16, 2 distinct advanced ancient cultures that overlap chronologically and geographically. The older culture has to be right just north of the younger culture, and they just barely meet in time and in space.
Okay.
And the older culture has to be just to the north of it.
Gotcha.
17, major geological events that occur when and where they're supposed to relative to the Book of Mormon, such as earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, submerged cities, cities burned with fire, and the city that got buried, and cities that are buried. How are we ever going to find a place that matches all of that? It's not even possible, right? You know what this is?
I'm
Just to
guessing
show you how
I'm guessing it's the model that fits the best.
I don't know how I stumbled across this, but this for me it illustrates the difficulty of what we're proposing, of what the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, who made it all up, was
Wait a
proposing
second.
to do.
Is that crap from the Lord of the Rings?
Correct.
Okay.
This is Tolkien's map from Lord of the Rings. One of the greatest authors who ever lived, telling one of the most epic stories ever told.
Sure.
And he gave us a whole world to explore. But it has problems. Look at the red marks. Strangely right-angled mountain ranges.
Yeah, that's kind of the
Yeah,
first
that's not going to work.
giveaway usually, yeah.
Look at the circle in the center top. The river runs parallel to the mountain range. When does that happen?
Not often.
All right. And I love this. You know all about this stuff. This is right.
Yeah.
This is in your wheelhouse.
Yep.
There's no watershed between the drainage
No,
basins.
there's none. There is no watershed there.
Right. And then the little circle in the lower middle, a river delta flows into the middle of another river.
Yeah, that doesn't happen either.
So even in this sense, as well thought out and as gifted as he was, he's just a man,
Right?
and his fictitious geography, the geomorphology, has problems
Sure. Sure, there's no way someone's going to take the Lord of the Rings and make the geology fit or geography fit
because it's
somewhere.
fiction.
Right.
Because it's fiction. Now I'm going to show us some theoretical maps of the Book of Mormon created using those 10 plus 17 uh, qualifications to qualify as Book of Mormon lands. Narrow neck of land, land northward, desolation, bountiful by the narrow neck, Zarahemla below that, the River Sidon flowing through that valley past Zarahemla and into the sea and emptying into the sea. And below that, south of that, is the land of the first inheritance, the land of Nephi. And somewhere down there, waters of Mormon in the city of Jerusalem. And then the various Book of Mormon cities laid out relative to that map and the
Right.
directions given in it. So far, so good.
Yep.
Here's another one I found very similar.
Very similar.
And here is how we see the process of John Sorensen's mind working in terms of discovering where it would be in the real world setting. So on the left, we see his theoretical map, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Here's his theoretical map of the Book of Mormon. Looks very much like the others. Narrow neck of land, land southward, land northward, River Sidon in the middle of the river valley, and land of Nephi below that. All pretty good. And the one single place, the Western Hemisphere, that matches that almost perfectly, almost, we'll talk about what the almost is what we see on the right.
Okay. And that's down
So
down
what
in
we're
Central America, right? Down
right, so
around.
what this is southern Mexico, this is the
Okay.
Gulf of Mexico, and that's the Yucatan.
All right.
So it's southern Mexico and northern Guatemala.
Okay.
And we'll look at this on a larger map. There's his map again, labeled. When all the relevant information from the text is taken into consideration, something which to date no one besides Sorensen has done, so far as I can tell, we are really left with only one place to look for the Book of Mormon lands. No geographical correlation could qualify except Mesoamerica or a portion of it, for only there were large cities, major populations and wars, and books found anciently around an isthmus. If we boil it down to the two basic qualifying factors, the populations have to be in the millions, and they have to have significant evidence of being literate. They had books.
Mm-hmm.
They read and they wrote.
Okay.
And thus far in the Western Hemisphere, there are only two cultures that satisfy those requirements: the Aztec and the Maya. The Aztec are way too late.
Right.
They were here when Cortez was here, right?
Okay.
So that leaves the Maya in terms of those two qualifications, so far as I understand. Let's go on. Now, here's a list of correlations. Let's go back up here. Show you a different map. Maybe we'll go past here. So if what we're talking about, does this make sense of where we are? Southern
Yes.
Mexico, Yucatan. These are called the Chiapas. That's called the Grijalva River. Sorensen says that's Sidon River, and Zarahemla and others are there, and there are ancient settlements there. And so this is the cradle, really. I mean, the land of Nephi was the first one, but this is really the homeland of the Nephite culture. And as they were driven northward, bountiful desolation in the final battle at Rama Cumorah, the Tuxtla Mountains.
Now, Ken, I'm going to ask a question here, and
Sure.
and I was just trying to look up a map, but I'll just ask you. On this screen, the north arrow is pointing up, right?
Yep.
Okay. So
We're
you
gonna have lots. We're gonna have lots of fun talking about that.
okay, because this map, I'm even for the ancients, to me, this map does not seem to hold water just
It,
based on
it
the fact that the land northward is actually to the west, the land southward is actually to the east, the East Sea is to the north, and the Sea is to the south.
correct. Correct. This is the single greatest criticism of the Sorensen model is that it doesn't follow true north closely at all, and we'll talk
Or
about
even
that.
magnetic north for that matter.
Or even magnetic north. So here are the uh, commonalities between Book of Mormon peoples and the people in the Zarahemla area, the Grijalva River Valley, the Grijalva River Valley. Number one, they both had a common rejection of Mayan culture. So this group that was living along that Grijalva River and the archaeological sites were not like the surrounding Maya.
Okay.
They were different, just like the Nephites rejected the surrounding Lamanite culture. Isolated from outside cultures and polities similar to the land of Zarahemla. Three, more direct access to the land northward compared to the Usumacinta River models. Let me show you that one real quick. So these are the major river systems of that region of Mesoamerica.
Mm-hmm.
The blue is the Grijalva, and the red is called the Usumacinta. And there are some Mesoamericanists who believe that the Usumacinta is the site.
Okay.
But what they're pointing out here is the Grijalva is actually the one that gives you access to the land northward, not the Usumacinta. And let me interject here. Brant Gardner believes that what happened to Limhi's party, so here they were in land southward. They hadn't been in 2 generations. They said, and they're probably told what you need to do is find the headwaters of the River Sidon and follow it. You will come to Zarahemla. He thinks they followed the wrong headwaters.
Okay.
What? What? Oh my gosh, what happened? Oh, that makes perfect sense to me. How that could happen. They followed the wrong river, went northward of where they were supposed to go, and ended up clear over here. Very interesting to me. All right. Oops. Number 4, close ties with the Olmec culture, similar to Mulekite Nephite ties to Jaredite culture. So this little group of people, this subset of Mayan culture, had ties with that little overlap with the
Right.
Jaredites. Number 5, more realistic travel distances between East and West Seas, far more prone to geological destruction, as mentioned at the time of Christ. We'll talk a lot about that. This group was called the Zoque Mixe. Their arrival in central Chiapas Depression by that Sidon River was the same time as the Mulekites moving up to the land of Zarahemla. So they arrived there about the same time. Number 8, influx of outside peoples around 200 BC at the time of Messiah's arrival into Zarahemla, increased population with the depression, with some locations doubling in site numbers. So in terms of the population base, it agrees exactly with what's going on in the Book of Mormon. Number 9, they had a dualistic society. Santa Rosa is the main ancient settlement in that Chiapas, in that Grijalva River Valley, representing two distinct groups of people living together, representative of the Mulekites and the Nephites. That's some wild coincidences. 10. 78 primary sites clustered around Santa Rosa. There were 7 churches in Zarahemla, recall. 125 BC. Number 11. The isthmus is called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the narrow neck of land. Tehuantepec means hills of wild beasts. Remember, it was called the wilderness of Hare Mounts is described as being full of wild beasts, just like Tehuantepec is. 12. The earliest long count date in Chiapa de Corzo, which is another ancient city along the Grijalva, is the same year the Nephites were forced out of Zarahemla. This also shows that riding was prevalent in the area at the right time.
Okay.
Now we'll run through these. 13. Pottery from highland Guatemala, which was the land of the first inheritance, starts to show up around 200 BC in the Chiapas Depression, where the Grijalva, the Sidon is.
Okay.
The same time that Mosiah left Nephi for Zarahemla. Interesting. 14. So whenever we refer to the Chiapas or the Grijalva, they're talking about Zarahemla. Central Chiapas Depression was abandoned around 350 AD. Haha. At the same time, the Nephites abandoned the land of Zarahemla. Up into Zarahemla from the land of Bountiful only makes sense if the land of Zarahemla is at a higher elevation than the land northward. The scriptures going from Bountiful up to Zarahemla when it's really going southward. Why would they say that? Because they said the same thing about going up to Nephi, because they're talking about elevation, not direction. Same as we do. Number 16, the name Sidom, where Alma blessed Yizram, has the same meaning as Zaktun, the old Maya name of Chiapa del Corzo, both meaning white or limestone. Chiapas Depression surrounded tightly by mountain wilderness on 3 sides as reported by the land of Zarahemla. Number 18, La Libertad in the Central Depression is abandoned at the same time the Lamanites take over Manti. Manti was the southernmost entrance to the Grijalva River Valley. It was the first settlement he came to before coming into Zarahemla. It was abandoned about 65 BC as the Lamanites were encroaching upon them. 19, the Sidon River was rapid enough to carry bodies out to sea. The Grijalva River has many quick rapids. 20, Mirador has evidence of destruction around 100 BC, similar to the destruction of Ammonihah at the same time. El Mirador is north, up toward the Yucatan of the Grijalva. 21, Santa Rosa, that would be Zarahemla, shows evidence of being partially destroyed by fire around 30 AD, as described by 3rd Nephi. What? 22. There was a relocation of sites and defensible positions by the Upper Grijalva from 200 BC to 200 AD during Alma Wars, indicating invaders from the south. 23. The first examples of elite burials from Chiapa del Corzo accompanied by weapons, suggesting a greater emphasis on military aspects of leadership during the Horcones or Alma Wars time period 200 BC to 0. Evidence of violence during the Horcones period at Chiapa del Corzo. 24. More direct access from the Grijalva River area to gold, silver, copper, and other ore deposits in the Chiapas Mountains compared to the Usumacinta. So the Grijalva River is preferable to the Usumacinta because they had more access to metals.
Gotcha.
25. The Zoque, which were the name of these people, both that's been given to the people at least, influence, and Maya ceramic style disappeared from the Chiapa del Corzo at the time Mosiah took over the land of Zarahemla. Gotcha. So if the Zoque were the Mulekites and the Mixe were the Nephites, that would explain some of that. All interesting stuff. Oh, brother. This is good. Okay. According to most versions of the Mesoamerican blah, blah, Mormon geography theory, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the narrow neck strip of land separating the Gulf of Mexico and Pacific Ocean, constitutes the narrow neck. While this strip of terra firma certainly reflects a narrow neck of land between two larger bodies of land, some may question how this section could be traversed in a day and a half by a Nephite when the narrowest point is 137 miles. It's a lot. The Book of Mormon's narrow neck was obviously not extremely narrow, because in Mosiah 8, we read that the Limhi explorers unknowingly passed through it and thought they were still around the land of Zarahemla. So it has to be wide enough for that to happen.
Right.
There are several possible explanations for the travel distance. The limit John Swartz explains that the travel distance for a Nephite might refer to someone accustomed to traveling long distances in short periods. Sorensen cites the example of some Mexican Indian foot runners who have been known to run up to 500 miles in 6 days. Or he cites a man in 73 who walked 500 miles in 6 days as a man who traveled 161 miles in a 24-hour period. So it's not unheard of. There's another view of the sites and the places labeled. We can look more of that later. The river systems. These are the corollaries between the Book of Mormon peoples and Mesoamerican history. They're practically identical. The approximate end of the Olmec civilization was around 600 BC. That was the approximate termination of the Jaredite lineages. Small tribes still continued. So forth. So in terms of the cultures, they correspond almost perfectly.
Okay.
We're going to talk a little bit about the earlier Jaredite culture, which
Okay.
is corresponded to the Olmec culture. These are the Olmec settlements throughout Mesoamerica, same
And
region.
the Olmecs were the ones who had the big statue of the heads, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Okay.
In fact, we'll talk more about Jerry Grover, incredible LDS, underappreciated LDS scholar. He wrote a book, and he thinks he has identified. The book is called The Swords of Shul. He identifies those heads with the kings in the Book of Mormon. I haven't even had a chance to read that yet.
Interesting.
And here's the cool thing. In contrast to the people trying to profit off the Heartlanders, Jerry Grover is giving all of his books away free download. Go to his website, download them. Amazing. So these are the early Jaredite settlements, Olmec settlements. Interesting that they go right down through what Mesoamericanists believe is Zarahemla, a Nephite home. Those are the trade routes of the Olmec. Purple diamonds of basalt, yellow magnetite, green squares, serpentine, and the green circles are where they were getting jade. You can see that's why they were going all these places to get that stuff.
Right.
Pretty cool. And now we get to your question. The most fundamental geographical problem associated with Sorensen's model has to do with issues of directionality. In order for his model to fit the geography of Mesoamerica, one must assume that Nephites had a system of directions with cardinal directions skewed 45 degrees or more off the usually observed cardinals. The phrases land northward, land southward can parallel the functions of north and south spatial orientation markers, but the Book of Mormon doesn't use those interchangeably. Land northward does not mean the same thing as land north. We find in 3 Nephi 6:2, and it came to pass that they did return to their own lands and their possessions, both on the north and on the south, both on the land northward and on the land southward. Were they just repeating themselves? There is no reason to indicate the spatial orientation twice. And the reference here clearly separates the land from the spatial orientation. They're talking about two different things. That's Brant Gardner. Brant Gardner gives us best treatment. We're going to talk about that here. Western cardinal directions are what? How does that say at the top?
Conceptually, a plus or
yes. So our cardinal
Conceptually,
directions are in the shape of a cross or a plus,
right.
right? And cleanly associated with the pure direction, equidistant from all other directions. The Mesoamerican system, which, and I'll show you pictures of them, on the other hand, is better represented in the form of an X. Why did they, instead of a plus or a cross sign, why do they have an X indicating their directions? Most ancient cultures derive direction from
Solstice.
solstice. It's exactly right, from the sun. East is not a line toward the sun at the equinox, but the entire wedge created by tracing the passage of the sun along the horizon from solstice to solstice from the center. Archaeologist Prudence Rice puts it clearly. Maya quadripartite organization of horizontal space is not strictly based on the four fixed cardinal directions recognized in the modern world.
Okay.
Instead, yes.
Oh, go ahead. Finish up.
Instead, the division seemed to invoke the solstice equinox positions and movements of the sun as it rises on the eastern horizon and sets on the western. Although the plausible origin of this conception is the travel of the sun along the horizon, Mesoamerican systems regularized their depictions and therefore their perceptions into a quadripartite system surrounding the center. The world was depicted as a square with lines drawn from corner to corner. And here is an actual codex.
Okay. So here's where I'm going to have some pushback on this. So I'm not a guy who believes that the Americas were uninhabited when the Lehites show up, right?
Right.
Or most likely even the Mulekites or the brother of Jared and his people.
Right.
But we do know that Semitic peoples had a pretty good understanding of the cardinal directions, right? And so the idea, and they also understood the solstices, right, as evidenced in Egypt, right? I think there's plenty of suggestion that they understood that. And so to drop a group of people and then just have them start using this I don't even know if this is the right word, equinoxial kind of pattern doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. To me, I think that they would still probably hold to their east-west kind of cross more than the X. And the reason for that is that the East, especially within these Semitic folks, has a lot to do with resurrection, those sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that that's hard for me to sell or buy, I should say,
See, I was
right off the
actually going to
bat.
present, I was going to present that as the opposite argument,
Okay,
that they perceived directionally, they perceived east and west. And that's the same thing that's happening in the New World. Now, here's the other thought I had. This is just me talking.
sure,
If you found yourself in this land, which was at a 45-degree angle about, and you were going to head northwest, but you didn't really have that in your vocabulary,
sure.
what would you call it?
Northward, a northerly direction,
Now, here's the
right?
interesting thing.
But
I
to
did a
me,
word. Yeah, go ahead.
but to me, that looks way more west than north, right? As a guy who makes his living looking at the lay of the land, I'm like, that is way more west than north, right?
Oh,
Even to
wow.
the novice.
Wow, play the expert card, Dave. Thanks a lot.
Sorry, no, I'm just saying, man. I'm just telling you what I'm looking at.
I mean, we're
I,
having this conversation because clearly this is perceived as the greatest weakness of the Mesoamerican model. But
right.
here's I did a word count of the
Okay.
Book of Mormon
Oh, cool. All right.
and how, in terms of the words indicating direction, how frequently they're used.
Okay.
It's extraordinary. East is used a lot. Northward, second most. West, yes. North, yes. Here's the other thing, though. Northward is always associated with a land. North is not. It's
Okay.
like an adjective. The land northward itself is referred to 25 times. Land north, 5 times. Eastward, 3. Westward, 0. So they were clearly oriented toward northward. I mean, if you put land northward and northward together, that's 70 times.
Right.
Anyway, now let's apply the same internal geography to the heartland geography models. Now, prior to putting this together, there were a bunch, in my experience, you tell me what yours is. I've seen the heartland models. I mean, there are like half a dozen different ones competing and changing all of the time.
There are. There are.
And why is that?
Because they're always looking for the next best fit.
Because they don't have a good one yet,
Okay.
if you ask me. If we apply that criteria that we said before, that is based on Book of Mormon's sayings, we have issues. So here is the model that you can find, get in they call it their geography kit on Book of Mormon Evidence.com, Meldrum's site. Lehi's landing here in Florida. The West Sea is a flooded Mississippi River. Zarahemla, you're talking about skewed directions. Bountiful's supposed to be north of Zarahemla. What?
Right.
Yeah. And Cumorah, north of that, yes. But wait a minute. Cumorah is supposed to be north of the narrow neck of land.
No, that would and to be fair, right? Again, being a guy who's willing to change if a smoking gun is found, if I'm going to call out the narrow neck of land down there in South America or Central America as skewed, I gotta say that this looks more west than north to me, or east
And,
north than north to me.
and here's a closer version of it. Part of how they get their narrow necks is by claiming that the Great Lakes were flooded. So they had a narrow neck here. And they have three narrow necks, one here, and one there. And I don't get that from the text at all. But I seem to be referring to the same place and the same thing.
Okay.
Then the other issue is north of the narrow neck, where Cumorah is supposed to be up here, there's supposed to be evidence of the greatest civilization that they'd ever seen. And archaeologically, again, nothing. Nothing. All right.
Fair.
So here we go. The hits. These are for me the insurmountable issues with the Heartland geography. Which, if I were to weigh this against their tenuous claims, this would win because it's factual. The River Sidon is flowing in the wrong direction. It's supposed to go north. Now they start to play word games with what mouth and head means, but we all and the way it's used in the
Right.
Book of Mormon, there's no question about that. Number two, this land, because Columbus visited it, he didn't come to the United States, did he?
No.
Number three, failure to recognize the non-English speaking members of the seat of Lehi, which now outnumber the English speaking. Four, failure to recognize Joseph Smith's statement that the New World events of the Book of Mormon occurred in Central America. Five, the Hopewell and Adena not coexisting between 588 BC and 300 BC. Six, no written language by either the Adena or the Hopewell. No sign of writing. Seven, no evidence in the United States of any cement buildings dating to 100 BC. Eight, no evidence of any gold in the area of the proposed heartland of the United States, let alone an abundant supply by the Adena or Hopewell. Nine, no evidence that the Adena lived so far northward from the Hopewell. They occupied the same space. 10, no evidence the Hopewell even existed until after the demise of the Adena. Number 11, the West Sea being in the wrong location. The West Sea cannot be north of Zarahemla, according to the Book of Mormon. That's when they were talking about the West Sea being the Great Lake, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
No narrow strip of mountainous wilderness going from the East Sea to the West Sea. There's none of that. The promised land was where Columbus, Lehi, Jared, we talked about that already. The landing place of Lehi on the south coast of the Gulf of Mexico instead of west of the land of Nephi, which the Book of Mormon teaches us, and south of the narrow strip of wilderness as required by the Book of Mormon. It could only have occurred in Central America. 15, Moroni promised and Joseph Smith stated that the land choice above all other lands was this continent. 16, the lack of required volcanoes and earthquakes in the eastern United States to fulfill the massive destruction needs of their Nephi. 8, I have some cool pictures of that. 17, the territory in Canada north of Lakes Erie and Ontario simply does not have required ruins that reflect the Book of Mormon statement that Jaredite civilization would be the greatest upon the earth at one period of time. 18, more than half of the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints speak Spanish, and most of those members live south of the border, and that's gone up since then. All right, I don't know what to do here. What I did, John Sorensen, just before 2013, when Mormon's Codex was published, he gave a teaser, a reading of it. And this is what the reading is. Let's start with this. He says, beginning as early as 1955, I undertook to synthesize what I was learning about ancient Mesoamerica into a form intended to answer the question, how did the Book of Mormon account relate to the civilization that once occupied that area? Now I have completed what will no doubt be my last major work, intended to convey what I have learned over more than 60 years of professional study of this matter. No one has spent that much time. He was described once as having inhaled the Book of Mormon. He knew it so well and the geographic reference so well. The book is entitled Mormon's Codex, and this presentation offers a preview of its essentials. He was modeling it, I think it was William Devers, who wrote a book about biblical archaeology and the Bible.
Right.
And to correlate those, he came up with a couple of a couple of scores of correlations. He did the same thing for the Book of Mormon lands. He says the full argument provides necessary explanations, extensive footnotes, over 1,300 bibliographical references, 3 appendices, and a dozen detailed maps. I identify what I call correspondences between the archaeological record for Mesoamerica and the text of the Book of Mormon. So the other guy did around 40. He says, I have identified some 420 correspondences that tie the Book of Mormon to the picture of ancient Mesoamerican civilization.
Wow.
Constructed by archaeologists and other researchers. And then he proceeds to read out of the 420, because he didn't have time, 106 of them. He just lists them.
Okay.
Now, in my zeal, I put all 106 here. We don't have time for that.
Right.
But we'll look at them at least.
Well, you give the reference up there in the slide. People can go look.
Yeah. Writing systems and records. He gives just 3. Lineage stories. Again, these are all exact correspondences with ancient Mesoamerican culture from that time period in that place.
Okay.
Human biology, political economy, society, material culture. He's only giving 10 of 37 that he found. Cultivation, wine, flocks and herds, elephants, the dearth of timber in the North Country, and cement. It's all there. Sacred towers, Nephite temples, silk and linen, unbelievable. Hundreds of miles of raised highways. I'll show you some photographs of those. Government, their central government, how they, political schisms, elections, major rulers, younger kings, sometimes installed, judicial function, imprisonment was not used as an ultimate form of punishment. Prisoners were only held temporarily for further examination or trial. Warfare, 15 of 30, 3 references. The way they fought, when they fought. Number 3, religion played a major role in warfare. Sometimes the primary cause of conflict. Imagine that. What is that? For both, Mason, blah, blah, blah. Priestly guidance. The threat of internal war, feuds, could last for generations. What? Nephi, Laman, and Lemuel?
Yeah, no.
Heads of local armies were called captains. What? Sons of captains. Some Mesoamerican armies were composed of units of 10,000 men. What?
Okay, that's interesting.
The Great Last Battle. The most widespread form of fortification was by excavating a dry moat, throwing the soil up in the inner bank against a timber palisade, and building another line of erect timbers atop it. Imagine that. 5 types of weapons agree with those of Mesoamerica. A battle standard. I think we might make it. We're going fast. Number 12, Mesoamerican wars sometimes continued until the victorious commander was able to drink the blood of the enemy leader. Sound
Mm-hmm.
familiar?
Yep.
Ideology, religion, 380 cultural patterns. Ugh. Mortality, anticipated paradise, resurrection, spiritual renewal, the Mesoamerican myth of the fall and the first couple, priestcraft, prophets, baptisms, sacrifice, communion, ritual belief. Now, that is going to deal with it in archaeological time periods. Ether's picture of the early Jaredite demography makes clear inferentially that an indigenous population already occupied the land where they arrived. This is before 600 BC. A decline of the society in which the Jaredites lived took place. So this is true for the Olmec. 3, the large archaeological site at San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, at present a preeminent Olmec city, coincided in time and nature with the great city built by the Jaredite king Lib at a spot by the narrow neck of land. What? The Jaredites used at least one writing system, which their founders had brought from Mesopotamia. From 3 to perhaps 5 systems of writing were employed in Mesoamerica by the end of the Jaredite era.
Hmm.
So from 600 BC, after the Lehites arrived, evidence for direct transmission of Olmec cultural elements to later societies. The Nephites moved to nearby highlands, became farmers. Faces on small clay figurines from the Valley of Guatemala dated to 300 BC have skin surfaces shaded white.
Hmm.
These correspond to differences between fair Nephites and dark Lamanites. 4, near the time of Messiah parties left, some evidence of warfare is found in the archaeology of Guatemala. A great wall, 22 feet high, protected the ancient ruined city now called Kimanaluyu. Kaminalhuyu in Guatemala. That's a hard one.
I wouldn't even have tried.
Urbanization, writing, pictures, ceramic sphere, a pyramid in Kaminalhuyu, major source of obsidian. Archaeology and history from 600 BC, part 2. Oh my gosh. See, it's overwhelming. It is. Archaeology from 81 to 200. Transition. I'm getting tired. Cult of the Feathered Serpent.
What's a koala?
There's issues. Some believe Quetzalcoatl and some don't think he represents it well, but wealth expands dramatically. The rise of factions, militaristic imagery. This is 200 to 400 after the period of peace. They start to have factions again. In around 8350, the Chiapas, where Zarahemla was, is depopulated to a war instigated by foes from Guatemala. Imagine that. They made a calendrical appointment to set up their climactic battle in Camorra. They did that. Human sacrifice appears. Secret organizations were instrumental. Genocidal war is the ultimate end of conflict, according to the Book of Mormon. The Mesoamerican record of the terminal classic era a few centuries later shows a similar historical result, extermination. The conclusion of his introduction, the 106 items. I said the intent of the book is to demonstrate that the Book of Mormon exhibits what one would expect of a historical document produced in the context of ancient Mesoamerican civilization. The intervening chapters have shown that what scholars have discovered about the civilization and what the Nephite record says are plainly related. At no less than 420 points, the text corresponds to characteristic Mesoamerican situation statements or allusions in history. It is not, I love how he says this, it is not rational to suppose that mere coincidence can account for similarities of this magnitude. The parallels are too striking and too sweeping to allow that causal explanation. Darn you, Joseph Smith, you lucky devil.
Okay, so can I ask a question here on
Sure.
the sacrifices? Because to me, that's something that has made sense from that I've heard people who favor the heartland model express, which is there doesn't seem to be any animals down in South America or Central America that would suffice for keeping the law of Moses, right? You could probably find some birds that would be okay, but there's no really hoofed animal down there that someone who's practicing the law of Moses is going to be able to look at and be like, yeah, we can use that.
That's one of the things that have changed. That's all changed as
That's
of late,
changed. Okay.
which we're
And
going to see right here.
okay.
In 2018 was the first large-scale LiDAR study they performed in Mesoamerica.
Okay.
National Geographic broke the story. I'll never forget as I watched it. They had these four eminent Mesoamerican archaeologists standing in front of this wall of screens, and suddenly they turned on the image of the LiDAR image of this, oh, what was it? Payten or Mirador? I forget which one. When they had initially excavated it, the central plaza, they estimated about 60,000 people in the population. What they couldn't have seen under all the trees and the flora, which the LiDAR stripped away so they could see it on this giant wall, were not 60,000 people, 60,000 new structures that
Hmm.
they had never witnessed before, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And you could see their mouths drop open. I read an account of an archaeologist who was heading up the project. And pretty soon there were dozens of people in that room looking at the screens with their mouths gaping open. After about 30 minutes, he told everybody to be quiet. And he said, what I want us to realize right now is that we have witnessed in the last 30 minutes more Mesoamerican archaeology exposed than in the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Boom. It's changed everything. So they
LiDAR
had
is amazing.
they had to revise their population estimates for that one city from 60,000 upwards to over a million.
Holy cow.
So and then the story is picked up by the other media. So this is a big deal. 2018. These reports are based on recently released findings of the largest LiDAR survey ever attempted for archaeological research by that Spanish name, led by Richard Hansen, LDS, and Fernando Pais. It mapped 10 tracts holding 2,100 square kilometers in the Mirador Basin and other areas of northern Guatemala. The surveyed area is less than half the size of Utah County.
Holy
So I was
cow.
looking that up today. Before LiDAR, they were saying that they had only explored 1% of the Mayan
Right.
ruins. Now with LiDAR, they've explored almost 5%.
Holy cow.
They had also to revise. In that time period, the Mirador Basin, the largest city in the world, was like Rome.
Right.
No longer. It was here in this
Yeah.
continent. According to Parley P. Pratt, early critics dismissed the Book of Mormon, saying there were no antiquities in America, no ruined cities, buildings, monuments, inscriptions, mounds, or fortifications to show the existence of such people as the Book of Mormon described. That's what people believed in Joseph Smith's lifetime. Based on this new evidence from the Maya lowlands, these grandiose descriptions are not far-fetched after all. The details in this story support dozens of verses in the Book of Mormon that describe dense populations, sophisticated economies, road networks, large-scale agriculture, intensive land use, disaster-prone landscapes, and prevalent warfare. Even statements about the whole face of the land being covered by people and buildings may have been more than just hyperbole.
Hmm.
There's a photograph of
Mm-hmm.
that LiDAR image. LiDAR images have revealed 60,000 previously unknown structures. We get to see some
Yeah.
of them. Leading experts' new population estimates as high as, I'm sorry, I said 1 million, 15 to 20 million. That's unbelievable
Right.
for the lowland Maya during the classic period. This means the Maya civilization was much more dense, complex, and advanced than previously thought. This is consistent with the situation described by Mormon. The whole face of the land had become covered with buildings, and the people were as numerous almost as it were the sand of the sea. They found fortifications everywhere. They were obsessed with them.
Hmm.
I love this LiDAR image. What do you see? You see the plaza, the central plaza, and you see
Yep.
pyramids at the top, the central pyramids, and you see raised highways. They found
No.
hundreds of miles of these, not in just the lowland Maya, but also in the highland Guatemala, the highland areas. Just recently found. Um, and they were elevated, so they functioned even during the rainy season. They
Right.
had a well-developed infrastructure provided public works such as dams, ditches, irrigation systems were on an industrial scale,
They
reservoirs and
were.
stone quarries, animals and food, remains of animal pens, flocks and herds, as discussed in the Book of Mormon, are evidenced by the LiDAR archaeology. They had flocks and herds of domesticated animals.
Okay, but what kind of animals does it say?
I'm sure it does. I don't remember. I knew you were going to ask me something that I wasn't prepared for, but I do believe they had sheep. Yes, and I think they had cattle.
Because I just did a quick Google search to see if goats were like indigenous to Central America. And again, if I'm going to question on one side, I question the other.
Of course.
With the archaeologists, as of right now, they are saying that they weren't introduced into the Americas until European settlement.
Okay. I I'll get back to you on that one. I'm not prepared to answer that one in total right
Okay,
now. I could shoot from the hip, but I'd rather not.
no, that's fine.
Now we get to the last section. You made it. Consider for a land to qualify as a Book of Mormon, it had to satisfy all the geological requirements, of which there are many,
Right.
all of the anthropological requirements, which are even more. And if those two agree, the law of two witnesses, that's pretty cool. And now, if we can get the geological evidence to agree with that, that's almost a slam dunk. And most of the geological references come from this verse. 3rd Nephi chapter 9, well, it's also chapter 8, but 3rd Nephi chapter 9, verses 3 through 10 is where Jesus Christ himself, his voice, announces to the surviving Nephites what happened to all of these cities.
Right.
Otherwise, they would not know. They didn't
Sure.
have satellites or planes or drones or anything like that. Zarahemla burned with fire. Moroni sunk in the depths of the sea. Moroni covered with earth. Gilgal I've sunk. Onihah and Mokum, and the city of Jerusalem, inhabitants thereof, caused the water and waters have I caused to come up in the stead thereof. Oops. Gideoni, Gideomna, Gideopi, yeah, Jacob, and Gimno have I caused to be sunk and made hills and valleys in the places thereof. What is that? And I buried the inhabitants in the depths of the earth. How did he do that? Jacobagoth, burned with fire. City of Josh, Gad, Kishkumen, burned with fire. These are all the same. So we see burned with fire, sunk in the sea, covered with earth, or the waters came up over them. Here we have Sorensen's map again. Zarahemla, burned with fire. Jerusalem, the waters covered up. Some of them he didn't have identities for,
Okay.
but this geologist, Jerry Grover, found them. Here's another one based on Sorensen's. Hill Shem, Hill Kamara, the Tuxtla Mountains, Bountiful. Wait till we talk about the geology of Bountiful. It'll blow your mind. Moroni, uh, swept away by the waters.
Hmm.
And then this one, I want to go back and forth. This is showing the archaeological sites
Okay.
in Mesoamerica. We can go back and forth and see. Well, here's Santa Rosa, Chapadarcozo, Palenque, Samabach. I want you to remember that one. That's going to be crazy.
Okay.
And Kaminahuyu, we believe the city of Nephi.
Which one does he believe is the city of Nephi?
Kaminahuyu,
Okay.
land of the first inheritance. And that Samabach is probably Jerusalem, if not one of the other lake cities on the waters of Mormon, which is Lake Atitlan. And then we have San Lorenz, La Venta, Tres Abotes, which were the great cities of the Olmec, Oaxaca, also Olmec.
Interesting.
All right. And then you see how that coincides with Sorensen's guesses, educated guesses. Oops. All right. Jerry Grover. All of the hazards described in 3rd Nephi that we read can be accounted for as the products of volcanic eruption and regional earthquakes. Do they ever happen together? It will also be useful to look at storm and hurricane hazards, as they may also have been operated. He decided they didn't, but the type of things you can expect from volcanic hazards, pyroclastic and surge flows, volcanic debris slides, lahars, ash and tephra fall, which they talk about. They couldn't light a fire, volcanic earthquakes, tsunami, and lava flow. In this area of Mesoamerica, what's the likelihood of not only finding the cities in place and the anthropological things in place, but those very geological causes of those horrible events? This is the volcano, which is right there near Hilrama, called the San Martin. It erupted in 1793, and the fallout radius was what we see here in this photograph, or in this
Interesting.
image, which would cover Bountiful, all things north, and coming down just north of Zarahemla. These are the confirmed volcanic eruption dates of San Martin,
Interesting.
which all
Yeah.
fall within those time
Yeah, those
periods.
that's it. That's very interesting.
A volcano scenario for the third Nephi disaster is not viable to account for the description given in the Book of Mormon, as volcanic earthquakes are simply not of the magnitudes necessary to account for the events and level of damage described in the Book of Mormon. So, in addition to volcano, a large regional earthquake will be necessary to account for the level of damage described. So he examines the major faults.
Right.
Let's see, volcano increasingly shows a mechanical relationship between earthquakes and volcanoes. A worldwide detailed study of volcano earthquake interactions was compiled by Egger and Walter in 2009. They determined some patterns that applied to Third Nephi's situation. One, volcanic eruptions can be triggered within seconds of an earthquake event. They most occur on the same day. The highest correlation of earthquakes triggering volcanic eruption was around the Pacific Ring of Fire, which is right where we're talking about. The most common events occur when the earthquake is near the volcano. We'll have to see where that is. Before an earthquake, there is less regional volcanic activity in the years leading up to the earthquake. After the earthquake, there is more regional volcanic activity, as we saw with San Martin. Paralleling these findings, the third Nephi eruption and earthquake occurred virtually simultaneously. The Isthmus of Tehuantepec is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. The San Martin volcano and the Tuxtla volcanic complex lies directly in the Veracruz fault system. I'll show you a picture of that. And the magma preferentially follows the fault zone to the surface. El Chichon and other volcanoes in the isthmus are also on fault zones and immediately adjacent to fault zones. And there it is. So here's Gulf of Mexico. This is where Rama is, up there in Mexico, southern Mexico. There's San Martin, and there's the fault line right there, running right through it.
Interesting.
Would clearly trigger that mess. So it would cause a fault line where most fissuring, subsidence, lateral spreading, liquefaction, and earthquake-induced landslides would be expected.
Gotcha.
Let's see. All right. It's a strike slip fault, which typically generates surface ruptures, fractures, and subsidence. It talks about the rocks breaking and stuff. It is located in the land northward where the worst damage occurred. Part of the fault segment is in the land southward and could cause damage in the land southward. It is located on and adjacent to the coastal plains. It occurs in areas that had significant population at the time. Satisfies most of the preferential conditions. Major volcano, San Martin, we talked about that. Major rivers and lakes. The only preferential criteria that does not appear to be met in the ability to cause subsidence in the city of Jerusalem because it's too far. As the intensity felt at a distance of 400 kilometers from the southern reach of Veracruz Fault, which would not be enough to cause any direct subsidence in Lake Atitlan, the waters of Mormon. However, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem may have involved non-earthquake related events, so this condition is not critical. The Veracruz Fault segment is the best fit for the primary location of the regional earthquake that occurred at the time of 3rd Nephi. And he talks about specific cities. The city of Zarahemla, quote, took fire. So it wasn't like fire was landing on it, as we will see. It was too far for the fallout of the fire. For an earthquake-assisted ignition, Santa Rosa, which was Zarahemla, along the Grijalva, based on the intensity equations and intensity calculations, chapter 10, would sit in an earthquake intensity zone of 4 to 5 on the Mercalli scale because it lies within 120 kilometers of the edge of the zone of intensity. And there's the picture of that. So there's the isthmus again, the narrow neck of land, the Grijalva, the Chiapas, Santa Rosa, Zarahemla. It's outside of that zone, but it would still be enough to cause things to shake, and he supposes that candles would fall over and it caught fire and burned. So under the Mercalli intensity scale, 4 or 5 is described as follows, which he calculates. Felt indoors by many, outdoors by a few, dishes, windows, doors disturbed, felt by nearly everyone, 5, many awakened, some dishes, windows broken, unstable, objects overturned, pendulums caught, may stop. It would appear that a regional earthquake along the Veracruz Fault may have been enough to overturn candles or other such elements of fire to start the spread of fire. As has been previously mentioned, there is always a possibility of large sympathetic earthquakes along faults near Zarahemla. The best fit explanation for the destruction of Zarahemla is ignition caused by either lightning or earthquake-induced upset of ignition sources with the presence of high winds from a large local storm. Moroni was caused to be sunk in the depths of the sea, according to the Book of Mormon. Moroni is a coastal city along the north shore on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. It does not itself sit within the anticipated area of direct earthquake subsidence, but the soils around it are susceptible to earthquake amplification of 1.6 points. So we put it in the intensity level of Mercalli level 7, which is quite bad.
That's big.
Liquefaction because of the susceptible soils, liquefaction could be a contributing factor to the substance. Can account for a drop in elevation. A best fit is Moroni would be a combination of earthquake damage and liquefaction and the impact of one of multiple tsunamis triggered by the submarine earthquake movement of the Veracruz Fault. So the fault lying partly in the water could have caused tsunamis. Anyway, all fits, time, place, and means. There's where he puts Moroni. So the narrow neck is over here.
Right.
And Zarahemla would be down here. And this will be going into the Yucatan. And that's where Moroni was.
Gotcha.
Oh, let's see. Oh, this one is cool. Sorensen says he doesn't know where it is, but the way it was, the destruction of the city was characterized that the earth was carried up upon the city, and in the place of that city, there became a great mountain. What in the heck is that talking about? On November 4th, 2007, along the Grijalva River in the state of Chiapas, occurred one of the largest landslides ever known. It destroyed the town. There was a town below it, and it wiped it out, creating a water and mud wave 50 meters high. Destroyed the town, killing 20 people, and moving 55 million cubic meters of rock and debris downslope that completely dammed up the river. one of the largest mass movements of Earth ever recorded. The landslide went through the river, burying the river and whatever was on the riverbank on the side of the river, leaving what could clearly be described as a great mountain. The original bed of the river was buried in 100 plus meters of material. The town of Juan del Grijalva was actually along the margin of the landslide, but still was destroyed and lives were lost. There's a photograph of it.
Holy cow.
So here's the Grijalva moving this direction, and it's dammed up on this side. The town was over here. That's how it looks on the grade.
Wow.
There's an aerial photograph of it.
Holy cow.
That's where the town was. If you look closely, you can see little buildings and stuff left. Heaped up upon the town and buried it. On the Grijalva, no less. That's a real photograph of the other side.
I
You
can
can
see it.
tell because the
Yeah.
water's deeper over there. Completely dammed up the river.
Wow.
Now, here's the crazy thing about this. In most areas where these types of large landslides have occurred, they are reoccurrences of prior landslides along the same plane of slip. Why? Because once these landslides occur, the river backs up against the landslide material, forming a lake until it overtops the landslide material. Once it overtops, it creates a new channel, generally following the alignment of the previous channel. Over time, the toe of the landslide is eroded away. Once the landslide toe material is eroded away, the resistance to slip for the rest of the landslide is removed, allowing for another reoccurrence of the landslide. It is likely that the Juan del Grijalva landslide is one of these situations and might be a good candidate for the landslide that destroyed Moroni or any other Nephite city in that area.
Wow.
That's where it occurred,
Holy cow.
right within the intensity level, which would have caused it, of the earthquake. Okay, this is arguably my favorite. City of Jerusalem. Identified by Sorensen as being on the south shoreline of Lake Atitlan. And he guessed that in 1980, and then they found it in 1990.
Wow.
Identified with the identification of the recently discovered submerged city of Samabah being a prime candidate. Lake Atitlan is a lake in the Guatemala highlands. Scientific class classified as endorheic, which means there is no surface outfall. It has no outlet.
Okay.
Water leaves the lake through a presumed system of subterranean fractures. Thus, while the inflow of the lake is quite variable, it's fed by two rivers and rain, the outflow remains constant. In consequence, the lake level is quite variable. Atitlan is recognized to be the deepest lake in Central America with maximum depth of about 340 meters, 1,120 feet. Wow. It's a volcanic part of a volcano.
Holy cow.
The lake is shaped by deep escarpments. The lake basin is volcanic in origin, filling an enormous caldera formed in an eruption 84,000 years ago.
Whew.
There it is. I have a friend who grew up in Guatemala and used to swim in the lake.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
And it shouldn't be surprising they found more than one settlement that's been buried by the lake.
Really?
But this is the big one. We know that the water line in the Book of Mormon times was at least 17 meters below the current average line based upon the known depth of the submerged city. Because Samabaya is 50 feet underwater, we know that the water line was lower than 50, by
Right.
at least 50 feet. There's probable landslide deposit and lava flows from the adjacent volcano. Rising water with or without subsidence and with or without burial are all possible. And there's a photograph of some of the walls underwater.
Right.
That's Sumabach underneath Lake Atitlan. Maybe the city of Jerusalem in the waters of Mormon. These cities Sorensen didn't have a good place for them, but they were all buried up in the depths of the earth, which leads Jerry Grover to consider subsidence,
Interesting.
covered with hills and valleys, and buried all, they were, and he thinks is quite informative, as it is a perfect description of the uniquely hummocky deposits of many volcanic debris avalanches and some volcanic pyroclastic flows. So he thinks these are cities in the north, right up near the volcano, the San Martin, and that they were buried in that fashion. There's a picture, the aftermath of St. Helens, where you
Right.
can see all these. This used to be a forest, and now it's buried, as those cities and peoples would have been by the San Martin.
Washington's got some interesting stuff to it. If you ever get a chance, take a look at an aerial photo of the Washington Scablands. In
Oh
my
yeah,
in my opinion, that's some pretty good stuff to be looking at, possible evidence of Noah's flood.
I
I
agree.
mean, the way that stuff ripped through there, whoo.
I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. So here's the ash fallout, the volcanic deposits from San Martin. So those cities that start with the G and are hard to pronounce would probably be within that radius. These, they didn't catch fire like Zarahemla did. They were caused to be burned with fire. The most obvious explanation for this method of destruction is ignition of the cities by volcanic fallout.
Hmm.
Zarahemla took fire. These were caused to be burned. That's not a secondary conflagration, as he says. So he's saying that they are in this radius, the fire zone, the fire fallout. And there's a second volcano which could have gone off as well at the same time period.
Wow.
Oh, Bountiful is good. This is cool. In the Book of Mormon, we're almost to the end. Hang in there, brother.
No, I'm
The
good, dude.
temple, the temple in the land of Bountiful is not noteworthy because of the description of its destruction, but it is noteworthy because it was apparently not destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
It was also situated in a geographic position such that the people were observing the great and marvelous change that had taken place. The scriptures do not say what the level of damage may have been at the temple or in the land of Bountiful, but the location clearly was positioned to support a multitude of 2,500 persons who were at or near the temple. And after Jesus appeared, these men, women, and children were told to return to their homes, which still existed, which they later did. The locale also contained or was immediately adjacent to a much larger population than 2,500 persons, because overnight, just by word of mouth, an exceeding great number of persons were on hand the next day. The temple was also adjacent to some body of water. So at the temple, they were spared. Nothing was destroyed. They looked across the river, and it was a holy disaster. How could that be?
Take a look.
The Sorensen model identifies the city of Bountiful as being in the area of the current city of Tonala, which is located on the west bank of the Tonala River prior to discharging into the Gulf of Mexico. This location does lie within the Macaulay Zone 8 area. However, it is located on stable bedrock, consisting of conglomerate, sandstone, and siltstone formations, which may have dampened surface oscillations. Importantly, directly across the Tonala River going eastward is an entirely different seismic situation. On the other side of the river, it's sediment, marsh deposits that are extremely susceptible to amplified ground shaking and potential liquefaction. The estimate for the amplification increase for this material, which extends for kilometers eastward and southward, is that it would add 2.4 points to the Mercalli scale, making the level 8 intensity estimated for the area to be 10.4. The destruction description for levels 10 and 11, wooden structures destroyed, masonry and frame structures destroyed with foundation, rails bent if they had drains. Few, if any, masonry structures would remain standing. Bridges would be destroyed. The rails would be bent greatly. So on the temple side, fine. On the other side of the river, level 10 and 11, knocking everything down. The identification of Bountiful located at Tonala under the Sorensen model is directly supported by the underlying geology and the regional earthquake scenario. The indication that Bountiful exhibited a much lower level of damage than areas immediately adjacent is supported by the underlying stable rock where Bountiful is, and is also supported by the extensive damage caused by the earthquake amplification in the marsh alluvial deposits that would have occurred within easterly across within sight easterly across the river for long distances east and south. This clearly squares with the people marveling and wondering, and were showing one with another the great and marvelous change which had taken place. No doubt some of the wonder would have been caused by seeing the relative difference in levels of destruction from one side of the river to the other, and this is why. Boom.
Hmm.
So the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the narrow neck of land, is right here.
Right.
And here we have Kamora Rama and the hill Shim. And Moroni, which had been swept out to the sea, was over here. And down here would be Zarahemla.
Okay.
So Bountiful was spared. Across the river was destroyed. Gee, I wonder why.
I see. Yeah, no, because on the other side they were up higher, right?
I don't know what the elevation was,
I
but
would be
this,
curious to see what the elevation changes. And the only reason I'd be curious is when I was living in Salt Lake when that last decent sized earthquake hit, the 5.7,
yeah.
and we could feel it obviously really well in the valley. But my buddy up in Heber said he barely felt anything. He did see the street lights sway. But
Yeah.
there's a significant difference, right? I think Heber sits at, don't quote me, I think 6,000. No, I'm not gonna guess. I'm just gonna look. I elevation
But what's cool, I mean, here's
Heber.
Sorensen again. The guy's prophetic. He puts Bountiful right here. He doesn't know what the soil composition is.
No,
Along comes Jerry Gover and he says Bountiful survived because it was on stable bedrock across the river, was subject to liquefaction. And that's why they had such destruction across the river from Bountiful. Anyway, I found that to be very interesting stuff.
yeah, I'd be curious to see what the difference in elevation is there because Heber sits a good 1,000 feet above Salt Lake.
So, his conclusions. One of the principal goals of this endeavor was to compare the Sorensen model with the existing geology. The Sorensen Mesoamerican geographic model is accurately supported by the known geological data against all odds. Although scientists are reticent to use the word proven, there are certain statements that can be made that are very close to the proven standard. A volcanic eruption occurred as part of the Third Nephi destruction. A volcanic eruption alone cannot account for all the destruction of Third Nephi. The destruction necessarily involved a regional earthquake. 3, based on the current data, a regional earthquake and a volcano and their after effects can account for all of the destruction in Third Nephi, with the exception of the city of Jerusalem, which appears to have been a local event. 4, the primary regional earthquake occurred on the Veracruz fault system. 5, the primary volcano involved is indicated to be the San Martin volcano based on its position in the isthmus and on the Veracruz fault system. And the eruption need not have exceeded a 4 on the VEI explosivity scale. I think it goes up to 8. As has hopefully been sufficiently explained, determining that a single volcano and a single fault system can account for all the destructive events in Third Nephi does not mean that there were no other volcanoes active or that were no other fault systems activated. There very well could have been more. But at the very minimum, San Martin, the Veracruz fault system, could have done everything Third Nephi Chapter 9 described
Yeah.
at the right time in history in exactly the right places with very interesting detailed descriptions of their destruction by Jesus himself. Take that to the bank.
Okay.
I didn't think we were going to make it.
Of course we'd make it. Okay, so I got some questions that maybe you could, because I'd be curious to get someone who's not a Heartlander their explanation of this. We've already talked about the animals a little bit that would be needed for sacrifice, and you said you were going to get back to me on those.
Hmm.
Because I do feel like if they're going to go over there and they're going to um, practice the law of Moses, they're going to need animals suitable for the sacrifice.
I would think so.
Okay, so there's that. My next critique of this, obviously, we've talked about just the how it all lays and north versus south and that whole thing. The next thing that I can't quite get an answer on is that in the Doctrine and Covenants, it's the Lord that's talking, and in 28 and 30 specifically, he mentions all 28 specifically, 8 and through 10 is where it's at. The Lord says, Oliver, you're going on a mission to the Lamanites. Now, if the Lamanites were down south, unless we're talking about post migration, post, um, final war migration, how would you account for the Lord telling that to Joseph to tell to Oliver that you're going to go
Amongst
on a mission to the Lamanites?
Yeah, amongst the Latter-day Saints in the 1830s and the 1840s,
Right.
Lamanite meant Native American to them. That was their terminology. Number one. Number two, as I've said before, uh, um, I believe the Lamanites that were helping to attack the Nephites were not descendants of Laman and Lemuel.
Okay.
I think they were native recruits. They were the leftover Jaredites. I mean,
Okay.
and to be frank, all of North and South America before Lehi ever set foot there was already populated to some extent by the
Sure.
remnants of the Jaredites. And so now the Lamanites become associated with them, affiliated, or Laman and Lemuel, they attach themselves and recruit from the local natives, which is why they constantly outnumbered the Nephites, and probably why they experienced some pigment color because they were interbreeding with the native population, who were Asians, who would have a darker pigment. Not necessarily so, but that's a possibility. So, in terms of all Native Americans, as we've talked about before, almost all Native Americans have Asian DNA.
Mm-hmm.
They're all related. And the DNA that the Lehites brought with them was a drop in the bucket, and there's practically no way it could survive in any meaningful amount.
Okay.
Still doesn't change the fact that just like you and I are inevitably descendants of, what was his name? King something.
Charlemagne.
Yeah, from Charlemagne. Most of the Native Americans today probably are descended in some respect or another from Lehi,
Okay. All
possibly,
right.
right? But so when we say Lamanites, they called practically all Native Americans Lamanites. In fact, even as a kid, we all did. We had no idea. I mean, I understand so much more about. We didn't know what the DNA of the Native Americans was back then. Now we do, and it's enlightening. As we talked in our earlier one about DNA, I find it actually a stronger argument for the Book of Mormon because it
Right.
makes so much more sense that this entire Western Hemisphere would be populated by the Jaredites, who came from the East, were probably descendants of Japheth,
Right.
with the J thing going on, and the Japheth was most likely the Asian populations of the world descended from Japheth. That makes so much sense to me,
Gotcha.
and it's so much more plausible and explainable over a 3,000 or 2,000 year time period than over
Sure.
a 600 year time period.
Sure. No, the only thing that gives me pause there is it's not the population who's saying those are the Lamanites. It's God Himself saying those are the Lamanites. Go preach to them. Um, that to me is something I've had a hard time working around because I will say this: if you're looking for just physical evidence, the Sorensen makes a compelling case, right? And to be honest, it's because of that compelling case that I'm, again, as I put it before, kind of a soft heartlander, right? I think that there's some room here.
Well, listen, at the very least, if that wasn't Sarah Himla, it was something that was a lot like what the Nephites were
Right.
doing, you know?
Exactly. And that's what I want to give Sorensen his due here, right? I don't think he's completely up in the night, personally. At the same time, there are certain things that I see that I have a hard time getting around, right? And they're firsthand accounts by Joseph. We have the words of the Lord saying, "Go preach to the Lamanites." And then we have the thing with the directional stuff. Having said that, it's you can't to me you can't just throw out everything Sorensen did, right? Based on
Right.
just that. And so that's where I kind of fall and where trying to get it all to fit, right? And let me be clear, I don't expect to have it all fitting by the time I die, right? I think this will be something they'll probably I'll learn when I'm on the other side.
We love a great puzzle. That's one of
Yep,
the things I was so excited to do this because talk about a puzzle.
it is a puzzle.
Thousands of pieces and to get them all to fit. I mean, the fact that it fits any place at all,
Is amazing.
as as closely as we have shown here tonight, is a testament of the Book of Mormon itself.
Absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, as we're wrapping this thing up, I think I want to tell people if you think you're going to find a smoking gun in the evidence that's been revealed so far, it's not there, right?
Mm.
It's just not. That's not to say something's not going to come forward at someday. I think it will. When that is, I don't know. But regardless, don't hitch your testimonies to this, right? If for some reason the evidence starts piling up on one side or the other, just be humble enough to be like, oh, I got that wrong. Trust me, as a guy who's been wrong a lot, it's not that bad. It's not that bad once you get used to it. Just own it. But and don't split your friends over this. And if you are going to split your friends, I want you to reach out to me because I think we should just go ahead and organize a cage match. I think, if you're going to fight over it, let's really fight over it. I feel like, we're leaving some money on the table. I think we can market this thing. Um, but yeah, dude, this was compelling. This was some interesting stuff and certainly gave me some new things to think about. I see you typing away and looking at Google.
Well, okay, Wade Miller, he's the preeminent LDS scientist who was exploring he was leading the way in terms of cataloging the existence of elephants coexisting with mankind in the
Sure. Yep.
Americas.
Yep.
And I mean, it's massive stuff. The same thing with horses. He was way ahead of
Yep.
that game. And here he is reporting on sheep in the New World. Sheep were probably among the animals brought to America by the Jaredites, although they were not stated explicitly by name. They most likely are to be included in the term flocks and are mentioned by name in Ether several generations later. They have been useful to man for many centuries, blah, blah, blah. The most common type is the mountain sheep. Their current geographic range extends only to northern Mexico. However, their past range was more extensive, as was their habitat before human settlements expanded. They are an animal that can be tamed or at least semi-domesticated, according to Geist. It's hard to imagine a wild animal more readily trained than mountain sheep. Sorensen noted the apparent recovery of sheep wool from a pre-Columbian burial site near Puebla. So, pre-Columbian, they found sheep wool. So they had sheep, clearly.
And
Petroglyphs,
but
petroglyphs from, I'm
that's
sorry,
only stretching to northern Mexico, right?
correct.
That doesn't go
Petroglyphs
any
from,
farther south.
well, part of the problem with organic remains in
They decay.
Mesoamerica is the climate. I mean, there's nothing. We know that the Aztecs were sacrificing people by the thousands, and we're lucky to
Yes.
find their skulls, you know. So that's part of the issue. Um, Petroglyphs from Mexico and the southwestern United States show many prehistoric depictions of sheep. It appears certain that the association of sheep and man occurred in America before this animal was brought over beginning in 1493 with Columbus' second voyage. So there is evidence for it. And like I say, the LIDAR shows that they had flocks and herds of something.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway,
Dude,
um,
this is fun stuff.
oh, gosh, it was so much, and I just felt terrible just dumping it on you as fast as I could.
No, you're
We
good.
barely had time to, dude, you're fast. You're fast. Anyway, the I what I if there was one thing I could impress upon people is the impossibility of what Joseph Smith did
Yes.
because he didn't do it. The impossibility of some accidental fictional book matching very precisely and in very precise terms ancient archaeological sites, cultures, traits, peoples, behaviors, let alone the geology and the geography of it. I mean, that's a practical impossibility.
Yeah.
And at least as I presented it tonight, I'm not a big fat liar. I mean, and it's
No.
I'm quoting really smart people.
Your your
Uh,
your character's above reproach here, dude. You've got
aw, thanks. It to me, do I base my testimony on it? No, I don't. Does it bolster my testimony? Yes, it does. Does it inform my understanding of the Book of Mormon? Holy cow, does it? I mean, when you read the Book of Mormon the first time, you can't even keep the people straight, let alone the places, the directions, the travels,
oh
the
yeah.
the stories inside stories,
I
and
was
then
gonna say the simple narrative portions are
yeah,
too complex at times.
I
Um,
agree.
and then to put it together in what was it, 90 days or something like that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, writers spend on average a year on a book, and the more complex the dialogue and the narrative, the longer that will go. So I mean, phew,
I mean, I loved the idea of the Tolkien map. It
yeah,
was doesn't look like anything, and it was geomorphically, what do you call it? Geologically, geographically flawed.
yeah.
Then we have this Book of Mormon between 600 and 1,000 geographical references, plus the geological references. There's actually a place that fits it almost perfectly, except that it's not true north. I think someday you can get over that,
Not as a
Dave.
surveyor, not as a
That's
surveyor,
true. I forgot who I was talking
not as a
to.
surveyor. You can't. The sun always rises in the east and it always sets in the west. You're not getting
Oh,
past that.
oh, but there's variation in that, my friend.
There is, but not enough that we would be able to flip a map 90 degrees.
They didn't flip it 90
It's
degrees.
almost 90 degrees. Look at the map. It's almost 90 degrees.
Only at one point. They still had to go um, northwardly to get there. So I don't know. I'm okay
Well,
with it.
if you took a step and then went directly north, I suppose you could say that you were northerly of your point of origin too.
Two steps west, one step north. I
That's
see what you're saying.
there.
You're funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, see, these are how these debates should go.
Yeah.
Um, dude, this was good stuff. I can't tell you how fun this was.
I cannot believe this did not make a dent in you. Where was it?
Dude, I told you I'm a soft heartlander, right? I've got no issues. And the other thing
That.
is, what's that?
This one. This one should have changed your mind right here.
Because we have something from the Maya showing the equatorial or yeah, the
Not
equatorial
just
rises.
this is symbolic of how they perceived direction.
This is how no, now here's where I would push back on this a little bit.
Oh, here we
This
go.
is
Bring it on.
this is actually how the Maya would have perceived this. My contention is you drop and we know they weren't Jews per se like you and I understand them, right? But you drop a Semitic people in the middle of a new land, it's hard for me to think that they're going to adopt this system as quick as what they seem to do based off of how important cardinal directions were to those people.
Well, they weren't abiding by true north. Now here, let's the land of Nephi right here is where they landed according
Okay.
to the Mesoamerican model, and then they went the narrow strip of wilderness down into Zarahemla. Which direction are they going?
West.
Dude, stop being so biased. It's more north than west,
Uh, I don't know,
isn't it?
dude.
It's northward. Northward.
I'm saying that's more west than north. If I'm using my cardinal directions, if I hold this up and crank it, that's more west than north, in
No,
my
that's not.
opinion.
That is not 45 degrees. It's close. But I would imagine they would call it northward because if they call it westward, it would take them into the sea. And the
My
land doesn't go to,
my thought is you have a lot of land to the north from the land of Nephi, if this is the model, that you could have called the land northward, right? To me, it makes sense if you're trying to describe something. And again, I want to say I have 21st century eyes, right?
yeah.
I would say that you would describe that way more westerly than north.
Oh man, I don't know if we can be friends anymore. I'm really upset by this.
It's all right. I get it. I run off all the good people. I understand.
They actually had an LDS archaeologist make an expedition to the Tuxtla Mountains,
Okay.
but clearly they're far too large for him to make any real dent. And he didn't find the cave. Gamora, but it would have been nice. He's the same guy who explored Bountiful in the old world
And look,
on
I
the
want to
Arabian Peninsula.
reiterate, it's just ideas at this point, right?
Oh yeah,
If tomorrow someone's digging around the sea east that should really be like
the Sea North.
the sea
Yeah,
north,
yeah,
I'm
that's probably the worst one. Yeah,
if they find, if they found that smoking gun there, right? Hey, here's where the records are. They're all right here. I'm gonna be like, you know what? I got my model wrong.
you
I'll
know
own it.
what you. I need to call Ken right now and get on my knees and plead for mercy.
I will. I will. I'll be like, Ken, once again, if you're a guy who's used to being as wrong as I am as often as I am, it's really not that big of a deal.
Oh,
I mean,
dude, well, we're all wrong at times. Um, what would be a smoking gun for you?
it's hard to say in these matters. I would say this because I haven't I'm pretty convinced on the Heartland model with some nuance, right? Again, as I've said, I would say something that would be beyond much debate, right? Like even if you were to show me something of the white bearded god around with 12 men as they break bread, a
Yeah,
hieroglyph,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
something like that. Something that I'm like, that would be really hard to get around. That to me would be my smoking gun, right? Or if somebody finds a city tomorrow that says, now entering Zarahemla, population 1.5 million, right? I think, I
That
think
that
at
would
that
be
point,
cool.
at that point, I'd be like, yep, yep, okay, I was wrong. That, but in the absence of that, and I want to be fair too, right? There's holes on the Heartland model, right?
Of
I'm
course.
not I'm not going to say that there's not holes there. It's just I suppose it depends largely upon how you value certain types of evidences, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And as a guy who puts a lot of stock into what Joseph says and what Scripture has said, I find for me that the preponderance of evidence tends to point more towards North America. But again, I'm willing to be wrong.
Okay. Before I forget,
Yes.
Previously, I forget what we were talking about last time, and I mentioned that if anybody wanted a PDF copy of my book, I'd be happy to send it to them
Yes.
free of charge. That was awesome. I had a few nice people, very kind and very considerate. I was very happy to send it to them. It occurs to me that any of these visits that you and I have, and the visuals of my slide presentation, it's in a PDF format.
Oh,
If any
sweet.
if anybody wants the slides for any of these talks that we have, I'll be happy to send them that PDF file. Very
Dude,
happy to do so.
that is such a great offer. Thank you. And look, I'm glad that the audience is as kind as what they are, but it's kind of what I've come to expect from this audience. I really do have a good group that are good folks. They really are. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's what I get. Sure enough.
except for a couple guys who like to troll me every time, but like I said, I'm just banking your stuff. All that's going into a book one day. So if you're going to insult me, come with some fire. I want some fire. I want some wit. This is going to go into publication someday. So put your A game on, son.
So what, in terms of the geology cities, which were your, man, that LiDAR stuff is amazing. That killed me.
Dude,
But
I'll tell you what. There is stuff Sorensen has found that deserves consideration, serious consideration, because there are things there that seem to be fits, you bullseyes, if you will.
yeah,
But
that landslide was cool. The
yeah,
Grijalba. Atitlan and Sumabaj as Sumabach. That's what it is. That
that
Sorensen 10 years in advance to say, yeah, right under there, you're going to find an ancient city. And lo and behold, they did.
he did it. Yep,
How do you do that, man? That's crazy.
yep. No, he definitely put some work into his model.
There it is, man.
So, dude,
It's all
this
about.
was fun. I'm so glad that we did this.
Me too. Me too. I hope the listeners are able to stick with us. That's a
Oh
lot.
yeah,
Oh my gosh. I put it together and I thought, I don't think we can get it all done in one, but we did. So
we did. We did. You're a smart guy. You always come prepared and ready to go. So it never. We usually get through stuff.
this is the biggest one I think we've done. I mean, covering the most material, it was daunting, but every time I get a chance to, and most of this stuff I've been familiar with, and it's kind of governed my thinking. But when you put it all together, put a big fat bow on it like this,
Oh yeah,
it's every single time it is stunning to me the truthfulness of this crazy Book of Mormon.
yeah. No, it's true, Ken. I mean, look, if you're looking for evidence, it's out there. And I suppose this is a good time to say this too. Don't be afraid to go out and get your hands dirty a little bit. Um, if you're a Mesoamerican guy, put in the time to research this stuff and maybe even take a trip down there, right? If you're a Heartland guy, it's close. Go look. Go see what you can find. There's groups and organizations out there that are always looking for the help on this stuff.
Who's doing
So,
the LIDAR on across the river from Nauvoo? Was that Neville or May?
I can't remember. I want to
And
say
I
it was May, but I might be wrong.
I haven't seen any. I was kind of excited for the results for that, and I haven't seen anything. So
I haven't heard anything either. I'll have to reach out and check a couple of contacts on that, but really I don't spend a ton of time thinking about this. Um
I
I
spent too much time thinking about it.
No, it's good.
Clearly,
This way you can come on and talk to someone who's way less educated like myself. So,
whatever.
but all right, Ken, it was fun, dude. We'll do it again.
Thanks as always.
All right. Thanks. Bye,
See ya.
everybody.